Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Vincent Caldwell, but folks just call me Vince. I've been a ranger for 13 years now, working the Daniel Boone National Forest along the Kentucky-Tennessee border. At 37, I've seen more wildlife than most people see in 10 lifetimes. Bears, wildcats, coyotes, you name it. I've tracked it through these mountains. I grew up in coal country, just like my daddy and his daddy before him. The mines dried up when I was 20, so I took my love of the outdoors and turned it into a job. My ex-wife Sarah used to joke that I loved these mountains more than I loved her. Maybe she was right. That's probably why she took my 2 boys and moved to Louisville 3 years back. The thing about being a ranger is that people expect you to know everything about the woods. They think because you wear the badge and carry the radio, nothing can surprise you out there. I used to think that too. Used to laugh at the old-timers who'd come into the ranger station with stories about the beast of Bladenboro or devil dogs roaming the ridges. Hillbilly moonshine talk, I'd tell myself. That was before October 1973. I was working the Pine Mountain Ridge system that month, up around 3,000 feet where the hardwood forest gets thick and the limestone caves run deep. It's pretty country, especially in fall when the leaves turn red and gold. But it's also isolated country, 45 miles to the nearest hospital, and if you get hurt in one of those hollows where the radio don't work, well, you better hope somebody comes looking for you. The Cherokee used to hunt these mountains. During the Civil War, deserters from both sides hid in the caves. There's history in every holler, most of it written in blood. I was checking hunting permits that Tuesday morning when Jake Morrison came stumbling into my station. Jake runs a hunting guide service, been taking city folks out for deer and turkey for 20 years. Good man, steady as they come. But that morning, his hands were shaking so bad he could barely hold his coffee cup. "Vince," he said, "we got a problem up on Pine Ridge." "What kind of problem?" "The kind that's got my hunting party ready to pack up and go home." Jake told me they'd been finding deer kills all over their hunting area, but not normal kills. These deer had been stripped clean of meat, right down to the bone. In some cases, the bones were cracked open and the marrow sucked out. "Sounds like a bear," I said. That's what I thought too. But Vince, I found one kill that was still warm, blood still wet. Whatever did it was there maybe 5 minutes before we were. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "There wasn't a scrap of meat left on that deer. 5 minutes, Vince. What can strip a 150-pound deer to bone in 5 minutes?" I grabbed my gear and followed Jake up to Pine Ridge. The morning was crisp, with that first hint of winter coming down from the north. As we hiked up the trail, I noticed something that should have been my first warning. The woods were quiet. Not the peaceful quiet you get on a calm morning, but the wrong kind of quiet. The kind that makes the hair on your neck stand up. No birdsong. No squirrels chattering. Even the insects had gone silent. "You notice how quiet it is?" Jake asked. I had noticed. In 13 years of walking these woods, I'd never heard them this quiet. It felt like the mountain was holding its breath. We found the kill site about a mile up the ridge. Jake was right. Whatever had been working on that deer was efficient. The skeleton lay in a small clearing, picked completely clean. The skull had been cracked open, the brain cavity empty. Even the hooves were gone. But it was the tracks around the kill that made me stop and stare. They looked like dog tracks, but wrong somehow. Too big. Each paw print was about the size of a dinner plate. The claws were longer than any dog or coyote I'd ever seen, and there was something else. Something that made my mouth go dry. The back paws had what looked like thumbs. I knelt down and measured the prints with my tape measure. 7 inches across, with claw marks extending another 2 inches beyond the pad. The stride length was over 4 feet, longer than any wolf, longer than most bears. "Jake," I said, "how many of these kills have you found?" 12 in the past 3 days, all just like this one. 12 kills in 3 days. That was a lot of meat, even for a pack. But what kind of pack left tracks like these? I spent the rest of the morning following the trail, but it seemed to vanish whenever it hit rock or hard ground. The tracks would just stop, as if whatever made them had simply disappeared. By the time I got back to the station that evening, I'd convinced myself it had to be a pack of feral dogs. Maybe some hunting dogs had gotten loose and gone wild. It happened sometimes, especially during hunting season. But as I sat in my truck writing up the incident report, I couldn't shake the image of those tracks. The way they'd looked almost human in the back. The way the forest had gone completely silent around that kill site. And I kept thinking about what Jake had said. 5 minutes. What strips a deer to bone in 5 minutes? That night, I called my supervisor and recommended we put out a warning to hunters about a possible pack of feral dogs in the Pine Ridge area. Standard procedure. Nothing unusual. But as I hung up the phone, I found myself checking the locks on my cabin door. For the first time in 13 years, these mountains felt dangerous. I should have trusted that feeling. The next morning brought news that made my stomach drop. Billy Hatfield called the station at 6 a.m. Billy's another ranger, works the southern section of the forest. We'd gone through training together, and I trusted him more than most. "Vince," he said, "I got 6 hunters missing." Jameson party had set up camp about 5 miles east of where Jake had found the deer kills. They were supposed to check in by radio every morning at 8. When Billy didn't hear from them by 10, he drove out to their campsite. He found their tents still standing, gear scattered around the fire pit. Their vehicles were still there, keys in the ignition, but no sign of the hunters. "Any tracks?" I asked. "Yeah, and you ain't gonna like 'em." Billy met me at the campsite an hour later. The Jameson party had picked a good spot, a small meadow beside a creek with good sight lines in all directions. These weren't city folks either. Tom Jameson was a retired Army sergeant, and his friends were all experienced outdoorsmen. But something had gone wrong here. The campsite looked like a whirlwind had hit it. Chairs overturned, coolers knocked over, food scattered everywhere. One tent had long tears in the side, like something with claws had slashed through it. Billy led me to the edge of the meadow where the trees started. "Look at this." The same tracks I'd seen the day before, but many more of them. They circled the campsite like wolves surrounding prey. But these weren't wolves. "Billy, look at the stride length on these." Some of the tracks showed jumps of 15 feet or more between paw prints. I'd never seen anything that could leap that far, except maybe a mountain cat. But mountain cats don't hunt in packs. We followed the trail into the woods. The tracks led us through thick underbrush, over fallen logs, around boulders. Whatever made these prints moved through the forest like it owned it. About a quarter mile from the campsite, we found the first sign of the hunters. A boot. Tom Jameson's boot, according to the size and brand. It was sitting upright on a fallen log like someone had carefully placed it there. The laces were still tied. "Where's his foot?" Billy asked quietly. That was the question I didn't want to think about. The boot looked like it had been pulled off, not cut. There was no blood, no torn leather, just an empty boot sitting on a log. We found more items as we followed the trail. A wallet, a hunting knife in its sheath, a baseball cap, all placed carefully, like markers along a path. But no sign of the men who'd owned them. The trail led us deeper into the woods, away from any established hiking path. We were in thick forest now, the kind where the canopy blocks most of the sunlight even at midday. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as we walked. Then Billy stopped. "You hear that?" At first I didn't hear anything. The same unnatural silence I'd noticed the day before. But then, faint and distant, came a sound that made my blood freeze. Howling. But not like any howling I'd ever heard. It started low, almost below the range of hearing, then rose in pitch until it was almost a scream. Then other voices joined in, creating a harmony that no pack of normal animals could make. The sound echoed through the trees, seeming to come from all directions at once. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, then faded back to silence. Billy and I looked at each other. We'd both been in these woods for years. and we'd never heard anything like that. "That ain't coyotes," Billy said. "No, it ain't." We kept following the trail, but something had changed. The forest felt different now, like we were being watched. I found myself checking over my shoulder every few steps. The trees seemed to lean in closer, creating shadows that moved when they shouldn't. About a mile from the campsite, the trail led to the edge of a cliff. Not a tall one, maybe 40 feet, but steep rock with no easy way down. The tracks went right to the edge and stopped. Billy peered over. "I can't see the bottom from here." I got on my belly and crawled to the edge. The cliff face dropped straight down to a narrow ledge, then dropped again into darkness. But there, on the ledge 40 feet below, something caught my eye. Movement. I squinted, trying to make out what I was seeing. The ledge was in shadow, but something large was moving around down there, something that looked like it was pacing back and forth. Then it looked up at me. For just a second I saw eyes. Red eyes that glowed like coals in the darkness. They stared right at me, intelligent and aware. Then whatever it was moved back into the shadows and disappeared. I scrambled back from the edge, my heart hammering. "We need to get back to the station." "What did you see?" "Nothing good." As we walked back through the forest, the howling started again. Closer this time and from multiple directions. It sounded like we were surrounded. We moved faster, trying not to run but not walking slow either. The trees seemed to close in around us, and I kept seeing movement in my peripheral vision. Shapes that disappeared when I turned to look. We made it back to our vehicles without seeing anything directly, but I could feel eyes on us the whole way. When we finally reached the road, I felt like I could breathe again. "What do we tell the families?" Billy asked. That was the question, wasn't it? What do you tell people when 6 grown men just vanish in the woods? When the only trail leads to a cliff, and the only explanation involves glowing red eyes and impossible howling? "We tell them we're doing everything we can to find their people," I said, "and we call for backup." But even as I said it, I knew backup wouldn't help. Whatever was out there in those woods, it wasn't something you could handle with more rangers and search dogs. That night, I sat in my cabin with all the lights on, my Remington 870 loaded and within reach. Every time the wind moved the trees outside, I thought I heard howling in the distance. I was starting to understand why the Cherokee had considered these mountains sacred. Some places aren't meant for people. And something was telling me we'd walked into one of those places. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those red eyes staring up at me from the cliff ledge. By dawn, I'd made a decision that probably saved my life. I was calling in help. Problem was, what kind of help do you call for something like this? I started with the state police, reported 6 missing hunters, and asked for search and rescue support. They promised to send a team by afternoon. Then I called my supervisor and requested additional ranger support. What I didn't tell anyone was what Billy and I had really seen out there. How do you put glowing red eyes and impossible howling in an official report? Billy met me at the station around 8. He looked like he hadn't slept either. "I've been thinking about those tracks," he said. "The way they just stopped at the cliff." "What about them?" "What if they didn't stop? What if whatever made them went down that cliff face?" I poured myself another cup of coffee. "Billy, that's a 40-foot drop onto solid rock." "I know what I saw yesterday. Those tracks weren't made by anything natural." Before I could answer, my radio crackled. It was Jake Morrison, and he sounded scared. "Vince, you need to get up to Pine Ridge right now." "What's wrong?" "Just get up here, and bring your gun." Billy and I loaded up and drove to Jake's hunting camp. We found him standing beside his truck, shotgun in hand, staring into the tree line. "They came back," he said. "Who came back?" Jake pointed to the ground around his camp. Fresh tracks, dozens of them. The same massive paw prints we'd been seeing, but these tracks told a different story. They didn't just pass through the camp. They had circled it, over and over, like whatever made them had spent hours walking around the tents while Jake and his hunters slept inside. "When did you first notice them?" I asked. "This morning when I got up to start the coffee. They weren't there when we went to bed last night." That meant Whatever made those tracks had visited the camp sometime during the night, while people were sleeping just yards away. Billy knelt down beside one of the clearest prints. Look at this. The track was different from the others we'd seen, deeper, more defined, and beside the main paw pad were smaller marks that looked disturbingly like fingerprints. That's not a paw, Billy said quietly. That's a hand. I stared at the print. Billy was right. The back of the track showed what could only be fingers, complete with what looked like claw marks where fingernails might be. Jake, where are your hunters now? Packed up and left first light. Can't say I blame them. As we examined more of the tracks, a pattern became clear. They led from the camp to the edge of the forest, then up toward the ridge, the same ridge where we'd found the cliff yesterday. We need to follow them, I said. Billy looked at me like I was crazy. After what we saw yesterday? 6 people are still missing, Billy. If there's a chance they're alive... He nodded reluctantly. All right. But this time we go armed, and we stay together. We left Jake at his camp and followed the tracks up the ridge. The forest was quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, more threatening, like the woods were waiting for something to happen. The tracks led us along the same path we'd taken the day before, but then veered off toward a section of forest I'd never explored. The terrain got rougher, loose rock, thick undergrowth, fallen trees everywhere. After about 2 miles, we came to another cliff face. But this one had something the other didn't, a cave opening about 20 feet up the rock wall. You see that? Billy pointed to the cave mouth. I did see it, and I also saw something else. Scratched into the rock face around the cave opening were marks that looked almost like writing. Not English, not anything I recognized, but too regular to be natural. Billy, give me a boost up there. Are you out of your mind? I need to see what's in that cave. Against his better judgment, Billy helped me climb up to the cave opening. The entrance was just big enough for a person to crawl through, but beyond it, the cave opened up into a larger chamber. I switched on my flashlight and crawled inside. The smell hit me first. A mix of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else. Something that reminded me of the sulfur smell you get near hot springs. But worse. As my flashlight beam played across the cave walls, I saw more of those scratched markings. They covered almost every surface, some carved deep into the rock, others looking almost painted on with something dark. Then I saw the paintings. They were crude but clear, stick figures of men being hunted by large 4-legged shapes. The figures showed packs of these creatures surrounding humans, bringing them down, dragging them back to caves. But it was the dates that made my blood run cold. Some of the paintings looked old, maybe hundreds of years, Cherokee work from the style. But others looked newer, much newer. One set of markings looked like it might have been made within the last few years. This wasn't new. Whatever was happening in these mountains had been happening for a long time. Vince, Billy's voice echoed up from below. You need to get out of there. I started to back out of the cave, but my flashlight beam caught something else. In the back corner of the chamber, partially hidden by shadows, was a pile of what looked like clothes. Human clothes. I crawled closer, even though every instinct told me to get out. The pile contained shirts, pants, boots, all torn and blood-stained. And on top of the pile was something that made my stomach lurch. Tom Jameson's hunting license, still in its plastic holder. Vince, get down here now. I scrambled out of the cave and dropped to the ground beside Billy. He was staring into the forest with his shotgun raised. What is it? Look. About 50 yards into the trees, shapes were moving. Large shapes, too big to be normal animals, slipping between the trunks like shadows. I counted at least 6, maybe more. They were circling us. Back to the truck, I said quietly. We started moving, trying not to run, but not wasting time either. The shapes in the forest kept pace with us, always staying just at the edge of vision. Every time I tried to get a clear look at one, it would melt back into the shadows. Then the howling started. It came from all around us. That same impossible harmony we'd heard before, but louder, closer. The sound echoed off the rock faces, making it seem like the whole mountain was singing. We reached our truck just as the howling reached a crescendo. As I fumbled for my keys, I caught a clear glimpse of one of the creatures. It stepped out from behind a tree about 30 yards away. At first glance, it looked like a huge dog, maybe 200 pounds, with black fur and pointed ears. But it was walking on its hind legs like a person. Its eyes glowed red in the afternoon light, and when it opened its mouth, I could see rows of teeth that belonged in a nightmare. Then it spoke. "Leave now," it said in a voice like gravel scraping against stone, "or join them." I don't remember getting in the truck or starting the engine. The next thing I knew, we were racing down the mountain road, both of us breathing hard. "Did that thing just talk to us?" Billy asked. I couldn't answer. My hands were shaking too hard to hold the steering wheel steady. When we got back to the ranger station, I made the hardest decision of my career. I called my supervisor and told him we needed to evacuate all hunters from the Pine Ridge area immediately. I didn't tell him why. How could I? But that night, as I sat in my cabin cleaning my shotgun, I knew this wasn't over. 6 people were still missing, and now I knew where they'd gone. The question was, what was I going to do about it? The state police search team found nothing. 3 days of helicopters, tracking dogs, and dozens of searchers combing the mountains, and they turned up exactly 0 trace of the missing hunters. Officially, the case was classified as persons missing in wilderness area and handed back to the Park Service. Unofficially, people were starting to talk, not just about missing hunters, but about strange sounds in the night and livestock disappearing from farms near the forest boundary, the kind of talk that brings reporters and curiosity seekers from 3 states away. My supervisor, Tom Bradley, called me into his office on Friday morning. "Vince, I'm getting pressure from above to reopen Pine Ridge to hunting. It's prime deer season, and we can't keep thousands of acres closed based on one incident." "Tom, those people didn't just get lost. Something happened to them. Something happens to people in the wilderness every year. They fall off cliffs, get lost, have heart attacks. That's why we have search and rescue protocols." I wanted to tell him about the cave paintings, about the creature that spoke to us, about tracks that defied explanation. But I knew how that conversation would end, with me on unpaid leave pending a psychological evaluation. "Give me one more weekend," I said. "Let me take another look up there before you reopen the area." Tom studied my face for a long moment. "All right. But Vince, this is it. Come Monday morning, Pine Ridge reopens." That Saturday morning, Billy and I drove up to the mountain one last time. We both knew this was probably a fool's errand, but we couldn't let it go. 6 people had vanished, and we were the only ones who knew the truth about what had happened to them. We parked at the Pine Ridge trailhead and loaded our packs. Along with our usual gear, we'd brought extra ammunition, emergency flares, and a battery-powered spotlight that could light up half the mountain. "You realize this is probably the stupidest thing we've ever done," Billy said as we started up the trail. "Probably." The forest felt different that morning. Not the unnatural silence we'd experienced before, but something else. An expectancy, like the mountains were waiting for us. The fall colors had reached their peak, turning the ridge into a tapestry of red and gold that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. We hiked directly to the cave where I'd found Tom Jameson's hunting license. The markings on the rock face seemed darker than before, as if they'd been refreshed recently. "I'm going back up there," I said. "We're both going." This time, we brought rope. Billy anchored it around a sturdy tree while I climbed up to the cave entrance. He followed a minute later, and we crawled into the chamber together. My flashlight beam revealed that the pile of clothes had grown larger. Fresh additions, a jacket I didn't recognize, a pair of boots, a watch still ticking on a severed wrist. But it was what we found in the deeper part of the cave that changed everything. The chamber extended much further back than I'd realized on my first visit. As we followed our flashlight beams deeper into the darkness, the cave opened into a much larger space, a natural cathedral with rock walls that stretched up beyond our light. And it wasn't empty. Bones littered the floor. Human bones, arranged in careful piles like some twisted collection. Skulls lined the walls like decorations, their empty sockets staring down at us. Some of the bones looked old, weathered by years in the cave. Others looked fresh. "Jesus Christ," Billy whispered. But the bones weren't the worst part. The worst part was the sound coming from even deeper in the cave, a low whimpering that could only be made by something still alive. We followed the sound deeper into the chamber, our flashlights cutting through air that grew thicker and more foul with every step. The whimpering got louder, accompanied by what sounded like chains rattling. In an alcove at the very back of the cave, we found them. 3 of the missing hunters, still alive but barely recognizable. They were chained to the cave wall by their ankles, their clothes torn to rags, their hair matted with filth. They looked up at our flashlights with eyes that had seen too much. "Help us!" one of them croaked. I thought it might be Tom Jameson, but couldn't be sure. "Please!" Billy was already working on the chains with his knife, trying to pry them loose from the rock. But the metal was thick, and his blade wasn't making much progress. "We need bolt cutters," he said. "I'll have to go back to the truck." That's when we heard them coming. The howling started first, echoing from the cave entrance behind us. Then came the sound of claws on stone and heavy breathing that seemed to come from multiple sources. "Too late," whispered one of the chained men. "They're back." Red eyes appeared at the edge of our flashlight beams. 6 pairs, then 8, then more than I could count. The creatures stood upright like men, but moved like animals, their massive forms filling the chamber. The largest one stepped forward into our light. Up close, I could see details that my mind didn't want to accept. Its body was covered in coarse black fur, but its hands were almost human, with long fingers that ended in curved claws. Its face was a mixture of wolf and man, with intelligent eyes that held a cruel awareness. When it spoke, its voice filled the entire chamber. "You should not have returned." "Let them go," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Take us instead." The creature's lips pulled back in what might have been a grin, revealing teeth like broken glass. "You misunderstand. You will join them. But first, you will feed us." More creatures moved into the light, surrounding us. I counted at least a dozen, maybe more, waiting in the shadows beyond. We were trapped in the deepest part of the cave with nowhere to run. Billy raised his shotgun, but the lead creature just laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Your weapons cannot kill what is already dead." That is when I remembered the emergency flares in my pack. I ripped one free and struck it against the cave wall. It burst into brilliant red light, and the effect on the creatures was immediate. They screamed and fell back, covering their eyes with their hands. The light seemed to cause them actual pain. "Billy, get the others loose." I struck a second flare and held them both high. The creatures retreated further, hissing and snarling, but unable to approach the light. Billy worked frantically on the chains while I used my free hand to reach for more flares. "Got one!" Billy hauled Tom Jameson to his feet, the hunter barely able to stand. The flares wouldn't last long, maybe 5 minutes each. I could see the creatures testing the edges of the light, waiting for their moment. Billy freed the second prisoner, but the third set of chains was proving stubborn. The creatures were getting bolder, creeping closer as they realized the flares were burning down. "Billy, we need to move." "Almost got it." The lead creature spoke again. "The light will fade, and when it does, we will feast on your bones for 1,000 years." My first flare sputtered and died. Immediately, the creatures surged forward. I struck another one, driving them back, but I was down to my last 2 flares. Billy finally got the third prisoner free. All 3 of the rescued hunters were in bad shape. Dehydrated, probably infected, definitely traumatized. But they could walk. "Can you make it to the cave entrance?" I asked Tom Jameson. He nodded weakly. "I think so." "Billy, get them out of here. I'll hold off these things. I'm not leaving you. One of us needs to get them to safety. Go." Billy helped the 3 survivors toward the cave entrance while I backed along behind them, holding the flares high. The creatures followed, staying just beyond the circle of light, their red eyes burning with hunger. We made it to the main chamber, then to the cave entrance. Billy got the survivors down the rope first, then started down himself. "Come on, Vince!" I was down to my last flare, and it was already burning low. The creatures had formed a semicircle around me, cutting off any retreat deeper into the cave. My only chance was to follow Billy down the rope. I clipped the flare to my belt and grabbed the rope. As soon as I started down, the creatures rushed forward. Claws scraped against stone inches from my head as I rappelled down the cliff face. The flare went out just as my feet hit the ground. Above us, the howling reached a volume that seemed to shake the entire mountain. But the creatures didn't follow us down. Either they couldn't, or they chose not to. We half-carried the 3 survivors back to our truck and drove straight to the hospital in Cumberland. As the doctors worked on the rescued hunters, I called Tom Bradley and told him everything. Everything. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the phone. "Vince," Tom said finally, "you're going to need to put all of this in writing." "I know. And you realize what this means for your career." I looked through the hospital window at Billy, who was giving his statement to a state trooper. Both men kept glancing at me with expressions I couldn't quite read. "Yeah," I said. "I know." The official report listed the incident as a cave rescue of 3 survivors following animal attack by unknown predators. The other 3 members of the hunting party were presumed dead. Their bodies never recovered. Tom Jameson and his 2 surviving friends spent 2 weeks in the hospital. Physically, they recovered from their ordeal. Mentally was another story. All 3 men described the same experience, being dragged from their campsite by creatures that walked upright but weren't human, kept in the cave as some kind of food supply, watching as their friends were taken deeper into the mountain and never came back. None of them would talk to reporters. All 3 moved away from Kentucky within 6 months. The cave was officially sealed with explosive charges, described in the paperwork as unstable geological formation posing danger to hikers. Pine Ridge was permanently closed to hunting and camping, redesignated as a wildlife observation area with access restricted to daylight hours only. Billy transferred to a desk job in Frankfort. Said he'd had enough of the deep woods to last him a lifetime. He still calls me sometimes, usually late at night when he can't sleep. We don't talk much about what happened in the cave, but we both listen to the weather reports more carefully now. On foggy nights, when the mountains are shrouded in mist, we both stay indoors. As for me, I took early retirement 6 months later, sold my cabin and moved to Florida, about as far from mountain country as I could get. The official reason was stress-related health issues. The real reason was that I couldn't stand being in those mountains anymore, knowing what was up there in the caves and hollows. But the thing is, the mountains followed me. I get reports now, forwarded by old colleagues who remember my last case. Disappearances in the Smokies, livestock killings in West Virginia, hunters finding impossible tracks in Pennsylvania and Virginia. The same pattern, over and over. They're spreading. Last month I got a call from a ranger in North Carolina. Young guy reminded me of myself 20 years ago. He'd found tracks near a campsite, huge paw prints with what looked like thumbs, and a stride length that defied explanation. "What do you think I should do?" he asked. I told him what I wish someone had told me back in 1973. Trust your instincts. Document everything. And if you ever hear that howling in the night, don't go looking for the source. Because some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The Cherokee were right to consider those mountains sacred. Some places aren't meant for people. Some things are better left alone in the dark. But now, they're not staying in the dark anymore. If you're planning to go hiking in the Appalachians, stick to the marked trails. Camp in designated areas. Travel in groups. And if you hear howling that sounds like singing, get out of the mountains immediately. Don't try to be a hero. Don't try to investigate. Just run, because the howlers of Cumberland Gap are still out there, and they're always hunting. My name is Robert Fairchild, but everyone calls me Bob. I've been a forest ranger for 20 years now, just like my dad and his dad before him. 3 generations of Fairchilds have worked these North Carolina mountains, and I thought I knew every tree, every trail, and every creature that called Pisgah National Forest home. I was wrong. It started on a hot August morning in 1963. The thunderheads were building over Black Balsam Knob, those dark clouds that roll in fast during summer and turn the world sideways with rain and lightning. I was sitting in the ranger station, filling out timber reports and drinking coffee that had gone cold an hour ago when the radio crackled to life. "Base, this is Murphy's logging. We got a real problem up here on Black Balsam." I knew Tom Murphy well. He'd been running logging operations in these mountains for 15 years, and he wasn't the kind of man to panic over much of anything. But his voice sounded different that morning. Tight. Scared, even. "What's the nature of your problem, Tom?" I asked, reaching for my hat. "Someone's been messing with our equipment. Big time. You need to get up here and see this." I grabbed my truck keys and headed out. The drive up to Black Balsam takes about 40 minutes on good roads, but the logging road was rough as a washboard. The higher I climbed, the thicker the air got with moisture from those storm clouds building overhead. Black Balsam Knob sits at 6,114 feet, covered in those strange grassy balds that make the mountains look like giant's shoulders. No trees up there, just grass and blueberry bushes, and a view that stretches to Tennessee on a clear day. The Cherokee used to call it the place of dark spirits, but I'd always figured that was just old stories meant to keep their children from wandering off. When I reached Murphy's camp, I could see why Tom sounded spooked. His main bulldozer, a big yellow Caterpillar that weighed 12 tons, was sitting upside down like a turtle on its back. The blade was buried 2 feet into the earth, and long scratches ran down the metal sides like claw marks. Tom met me at the truck, his hard hat askew and dirt on his clothes. "Bob, I've been logging these mountains my whole life, and I never seen anything like this." I walked around the dozer, taking pictures and making notes. "Could have been eco-terrorists," I said, though even as I said it, the words felt wrong. "Some of those college kids from Asheville get pretty worked up about clear-cutting." "That's what I thought at first," Tom said. "But look at this." He led me to where his crew had been working the day before. A 20-foot pine tree lay on the ground, but it hadn't been cut down. The trunk was snapped clean in half, like someone had grabbed it and twisted it like a breadstick. Sap still ran from the broken wood. "No machine did this," Tom said, "and no group of college kids could flip that dozer." I knelt down beside the tree and ran my fingers over the break. The wood was splintered in a way I'd never seen before, not from wind or lightning or any natural cause I could think of. That's when I noticed how quiet it was. 20 years in the forest, and you learn to listen. There's always noise in the woods, birds singing, squirrels chattering, insects buzzing. But here, nothing, not even the sound of wind in the grass. Like every living thing had packed up and left. "Where's your crew?" I asked. "Went home yesterday after we found the dozer like this. Can't say I blame them." Tom took off his hard hat and wiped sweat from his forehead. "Bob, my granddaddy used to tell stories about things in these mountains. Old Cherokee stories he heard from his granddaddy. Said some places were better left alone. I'd heard those stories too, growing up. Mountain monst, earths and forest spirits and things that went bump in the night. But I was a practical man, raised on science and facts." "Tom, there's got to be a logical explanation for this." He looked at Tad. Me for a long moment, then pointed to the ground near the overturned dozer. "Then explain that." I followed his finger and felt my stomach drop. There in the soft earth was a footprint. Not a boot print or a tire track, but an actual footprint. It was 2 feet long and nearly 8 inches wide, pressed deep into the dirt. The toes, if that's what they were, had left gouges that looked like claw marks. I knelt down and measured it with my diameter tape, photographing it from every angle. The print was fresh, made some time after the rain 2 nights ago, and it was deep. Whatever had made it was heavy, real heavy. "There are more over by the tree line," Tom said quietly. I followed the trail of prints across the work site. They were spaced about 6 feet apart, like whatever made them had a stride longer than any man. At the edge of the clearing, they disappeared into the thick woods that surrounded the bald. The storm clouds were getting darker, and I could hear thunder rolling in the distance. "Tom, I want you and your crew to stay away from here until I figure out what's going on." "Don't have to tell me twice," he said. "But Bob, be careful up here. Something ain't right about this place." As I drove back down the mountain, those prints stayed burned in my mind. In 20 years of ranging, I'd seen every kind of track these mountains could produce: bear, deer, wild boar, even the occasional cougar. But nothing with feet like that. Nothing that could flip a 12-ton bulldozer and snap a pine tree in half with its bare hands. The rain started just as I reached the station, fat drops that turned the dust on my windshield into mud. I sat in the truck for a moment, listening to the rain drum on the roof and trying to make sense of what I'd seen. My wife Sarah was making dinner when I got home, and my youngest daughter Jenny ran to hug my legs like she did every evening. Gee, normal things, safe things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from the woods, something with feet 2 feet long and the strength to twist trees like pipe cleaners. That night, I lay in bed listening to the storm rage outside and thinking about old Cherokee stories, about places that were better left alone, about dark spirits that lived in the high places of the mountains. I should have listened to those stories. The next morning dawned clear and cool, the kind of day that usually made me grateful to work in these mountains. But as I drove back up to Black Balsam, I couldn't shake the uneasiness that had settled in my gut like bad food. I'd called Jack Wisenhunt the night before. Jack was the best tracker in 3 counties, with Cherokee blood and eyes that could read sign like other men read newspapers. If anyone could help me figure out what had made those prints, it was Jack. He was waiting for me at the logging site, crouched down beside the overturned bulldozer with his fingers in the dirt. Jack was a small man, maybe 5'6", but he moved through the forest like he was part of it. His grandmother had been full Cherokee, and she'd taught him things about these mountains that weren't written in any forestry manual. "Morning, Bob," he said without looking up. "Tom Murphy called me last night, said you found something interesting." That's one word for it. I showed him the footprints, watching his face as he studied them. Jack's expression didn't change much, but I saw his jaw tighten. "How long since you've been up here?" he asked. "Maybe 6 months. We don't patrol the high balds much during logging season." Jack stood up and wiped his hands on his jeans. "Come with me. There's something you need to see." He led me into the tree line where the footprints disappeared. The woods here were thick with rhododendron and mountain laurel. The kind of tangle that makes walking hard work. But Jack moved through it like water, following a path I couldn't see. About 100 yards in, he stopped and pointed to a massive oak tree. The trunk was 4 feet thick, old growth that had been standing when the Cherokees still hunted these ridges. But now it leaned at an odd angle, its roots pulled half out of the ground. "Something pushed this tree over," Jack said. "Something strong enough to uproot a tree that's been growing here for maybe 200 years. I walked around the oak, trying to understand what I was seeing. Trees fell all the time in the mountains, wind, lightning, disease. But this tree looked healthy, and there were no scorch marks from lightning. The roots were muddy and fresh, like it had happened recently." "Jack, what kind of animal could do this?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying the disturbed earth around the tree's base. "My grandmother used to tell stories about guardians in these mountains, spirits that protected the old growth forests from people who would harm them. Come on, Jack. You know I respect Cherokee traditions, but look around you, Bob. Really look." I did. The forest was wrong somehow. Not just quiet like yesterday, but actually wrong. The smaller trees near the fallen oak were all bent away from it, like they were trying to get as far away as possible. Bushes were crushed flat in patterns that didn't make sense, and everywhere, that unnatural silence. Jack knelt down and pointed to another print in the soft earth near the oak's roots. This one was even clearer than the ones at the logging site. I could see the individual toe marks, 5 of them, each ending in what looked like a claw. "Whatever made this isn't natural," Jack said quietly. "Not natural the way we understand it." That's when we heard the sound. It started as a low rumble so deep I felt it in my chest more than heard it. Like distant thunder, but the sky was clear. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the mountains in a way that made my teeth ache. Jack grabbed my arm. "We need to go, now." "What was that?" Something that doesn't want us here. We made our way back to the clearing, but I could feel eyes on us the whole time. Not human eyes. Something bigger. Something that watched from the shadows between the trees and didn't like what it saw. When we reached our trucks, Jack pulled out a pack of cigarettes with shaking hands. I'd known him for 10 years and had never seen him smoke. "Jack, what did your grandmother tell you about these guardians?" He lit the cigarette and took a long drag. "She said they were older than the Cherokee, older than people. They were part of the mountains themselves, made from stone and root and the deep earth. She said they slept most of the time. But if you disturbed the old places, the sacred places, they would wake up." And what happened when they woke up? Bad things, Bob. Very bad things. I looked back at the tree line, half expecting to see something looking back at us. "So what are you saying? That Murphy's logging operation woke up some kind of mountain spirit?" "I'm saying my grandmother was a wise woman, and she never lied to me about anything important." Jack dropped his cigarette and ground it under his heel. "And I'm saying those prints weren't made by any animal I've ever seen." That afternoon, I called Tom Murphy and told him to keep his crew away from Black Balsam for a few more days. I didn't tell him why. How could I? That I thought his bulldozer had been flipped by a Cherokee forest spirit? Instead, I spent the rest of the day researching. I drove to the library in Asheville and pulled every book I could find about Cherokee folklore, local history, anything that might explain what Jack and I had found up on the mountain. Most of it was the usual stuff. Tourist tales about mountain monsters and ghost stories meant to scare city folks. But buried in a book about Cherokee oral traditions, I found something that made my blood run cold. The Cherokee had indeed considered Black Balsam Knob sacred, but not in a good way. They called it Invi Atsila, the place where angry spirits slept. According to the stories, it was home to creatures they called Kituwa, forest guardians that could take the shape of massive men covered in bark and leaves. The book said the Cherokee would never hunt or camp near Black Balsam, and they would leave offerings at the base of the mountain to keep the guardians sleeping. The last recorded sighting was in 1838, during the Trail of Tears, when several Cherokee families trying to hide in the mountains reported seeing tree giants that threw boulders like pebbles and could uproot oaks with their bare hands. I drove home that evening with my head spinning. Part of me, the rational, educated part, knew I was letting mountain folklore get the better of me. But another part, the part that had felt those eyes watching from the forest, wasn't so sure. Sarah made pot roast for dinner, and we sat around the table like any normal family. Jenny talked about her day at summer camp, and my oldest boy Mike complained about his job at the hardware store. Normal things, safe things. But when I went to bed that night, I couldn't stop thinking about trees being uprooted like weeds and bulldozers flipped like toys, about prints in the earth made by something that shouldn't exist. And somewhere in the deep woods of Black Balsam Knob, something was watching the lights in the valley below and deciding what to do about the men who had disturbed its sleep. 3 days later, Tom Murphy called the station in a panic. "Bob, you need to get up here right now. It's back, and this time it's worse." I was halfway to Black Balsam before Tom finished explaining what his night watchman had seen. Eddie Caldwell had been guarding the equipment since the first incident, sleeping in his truck with a thermos of coffee and a .32-06 rifle. Around midnight, he'd heard what sounded like trees falling. When he turned on his spotlight, he'd seen something that sent him racing down the mountain without looking back. Eddie was sitting in Murphy's office when I arrived, drinking whiskey despite it being only 10 in the morning. His hands shook as he lit another cigarette. "It was huge, Bob. 15 feet tall, maybe more. Covered in what looked like tree bark, but it moved. It moved like it was alive." "What did it do?" I asked. "Picked up that big log skidder like it was a toy truck and threw it into the trees. Then it looked right at me with these green eyes that glowed like a cat's, and I knew if I didn't get out of there right then, I wasn't getting out at all." I drove up to the worksite with Jack, both of us armed and wary. What we found was worse than I'd expected. The log skidder, a machine that weighed 8 tons, was indeed wrapped around a pine tree 30 feet from where it had been parked. The impact had split the tree trunk right down the middle. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the trail of destruction that led from the work site into the forest. Trees were snapped off 10 feet above the ground. Boulders the size of washing machines had been hurled around like snowballs. And everywhere, those massive footprints, pressed deep into the earth with a weight that made my boots seem like feathers. "It's hunting now," Jack said quietly as we followed the trail. "Yesterday, it was just defending its territory. Today, it's actively trying to drive people away." "People don't hunt bulldozers, Jack. This isn't people." The trail led us deeper into the woods than I'd ever been on Black Balsam. The forest was old here, really old. Oak trees with trunks so big 3 men couldn't wrap their arms around them. Rhododendron thickets that blocked out the sun. And that same unnatural quiet that made every footstep sound like a gunshot. About a mile in, Jack stopped suddenly and held up his hand. "Do you hear that?" I listened. At first, nothing. Then, very faintly, a sound like breathing. Deep, slow breaths that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Which direction?" I whispered. Jack pointed ahead where the trail curved around a massive granite outcrop. The breathing was getting louder, and with it came a smell like rich earth after rain, mixed with something wilder, something that belonged to deep forests and old mountains. We crept forward, our rifles ready but feeling useless against whatever had thrown an 8-ton machine into a tree. As we rounded the rock, I saw something that made my brain struggle to understand what my eyes were showing me. There was a clearing ahead, maybe 50 feet across, surrounded by the biggest trees I'd ever seen. And in the center of that clearing stood something that shouldn't exist. It was at least 15 feet tall, maybe more, with arms like tree trunks and a torso that looked like it had been carved from living wood. Its skin wasn't skin at all. It was bark, real bark, with moss growing in the creases and small ferns sprouting from its shoulders. When it turned its massive head to look at us, I saw eyes like pools of deep water, ancient and intelligent, and completely alien. The forest giant, because that's what it was, exactly what Jack's grandmother had described, studied us for a long moment. Then it opened its mouth and made a sound that was part roar, part wind through branches, and part earthquake. The sound hit us like a physical thing, dropping us to our knees and making our ears ring. "Don't move," Jack whispered. "Don't even breathe if you can help it." The creature took a step toward us, and the ground shook. Another step, and pine needles rained down from the trees above. It moved like an avalanche, slow but unstoppable, and with each footfall I could feel the mountain itself trembling. When it was maybe 20 feet away, it stopped and sniffed the air like a dog catching a scent. Then it spoke, and its voice was like wind in deep caves. "You have disturbed the old places." The words came slowly, formed by a mouth not meant for human speech. But the meaning was clear enough. "We didn't mean any harm," I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. The giant's eyes focused on me with an intelligence that was older than human civilization. "The iron beasts bite the sacred trees. The noise wakes the deep sleepers." It was talking about the logging equipment. The bulldozers and chainsaws were iron beasts to this creature, and the noise was disturbing something even it respected. "We'll stop," I said. "We'll make them stop cutting trees here." The forest giant tilted its massive head, considering. Then it reached down with one enormous hand, a hand with fingers like tree branches, and plucked up a boulder the size of a car. Without any visible effort, it threw the boulder over our heads. It crashed into the forest behind us with a sound like thunder. "You will make them stop?" "Yes," I said, not knowing how, but knowing I had to try. "We'll stop them." The creature studied us for another long moment, then nodded once. It turned and walked into the deepest part of the forest, each footstep shaking the ground, until the trees swallowed it up and it was gone. Jack and I sat there in that clearing for a long time, neither of us speaking. Finally, he lit another cigarette and said, "Well, that happened. Nobody's going to believe this. Nobody has to believe it. They just have to stay away from the old places." We made our way back to the trucks as the sun was setting, both of us jumping at every sound. I called Tom Murphy that night and told him his logging contract was canceled. I didn't explain why. How could I? But something in my voice must have convinced him not to argue. The next morning, I drove to the Forest Service regional office and filed a report recommending that the upper elevations of Black Balsam Knob be designated as protected wilderness. I made up a story about unstable geological conditions and potential landslides. It wasn't entirely a lie. The ground up there was definitely unstable, especially when something that weighed several tons was walking around on it, protecting trees that were older than the first European settlements in North Carolina. But I knew our encounter with the forest giant was just the beginning. Something that old, that powerful, didn't just go back to sleep because a couple of humans promised to be good. It was awake now, and it was watching. And I had the feeling it wasn't the only one. 2 weeks after our encounter with the forest giant, I thought the worst was over. The logging operations had been suspended, the equipment had been hauled away, and Black Balsam Knob had returned to its ancient quiet. I was wrong to feel relieved. The call came on a Tuesday morning. A group of hikers from Georgia had gone missing on the Art Loeb Trail, the path that crosses over Black Balsam Knob. They'd been due back 2 days ago, and their families were getting worried. Jack and I organized a search party, but I already had a sick feeling about what we'd find, or wouldn't find. The Art Loeb Trail is popular with hikers because it offers some of the best views in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It runs right across the grassy balds of Black Balsam, through the same area where the forest giant had made its home. I should have closed the trail, but how do you explain to the Forest Service that a 15-foot tree creature doesn't want visitors? We found their campsite on the second day of searching. Their tent was still standing, their packs were untouched, but the hikers themselves were gone. The only sign of what happened was a circle of those massive footprints around the campsite and 3 sets of human tracks leading into the deepest part of the forest. "They walked out on their own," said Jim Patterson, one of the search and rescue volunteers. "Tracks are clear as day." But Jack knelt down and studied the human prints more carefully. "Look at the spacing," he said quietly. "They're all exactly the same distance apart, like they were walking in step. So people don't walk in perfect step, Jim, not unless they're being made to." I felt that familiar chill run down my spine. "You think it took them?" "I think it called them," Jack said. "My grandmother told stories about that too, about how the old guardians could sing to people, make them follow into places they should never go." We followed the trail deeper into the forest, past the clearing where Jack and I had first encountered the creature. The human footprints continued in their perfect, unnatural rhythm, leading toward the most remote part of the mountain, a place where the trees grew so thick that noon looked like twilight, and the only sounds were our own breathing and the crunch of dead leaves under our boots. After an hour of climbing, we found them. The 3 hikers were standing in another clearing, but they weren't moving. They stood perfectly still, facing the center of the space where an enormous oak tree grew, its trunk easily 8 feet across. Their eyes were open but empty, like they were sleepwalking with their eyes wide. "Hey!" Jim called out. "Are you folks okay?" None of them responded. They just kept staring at the tree with that blank, dreamy expression people get when they're hypnotized. Jack grabbed my arm. "Don't get too close. Whatever's got hold of them, we don't want it getting hold of us too." That's when I heard it. A sound like wind through leaves, but there was no wind. A whisper that seemed to come from the tree itself, speaking words in a language I didn't understand, but somehow felt in my bones. The forest giant stepped out from behind the oak tree like it had been part of the trunk all along. In the dim forest light, it looked even more like a living tree than before. Moss covered its shoulders, small saplings grew from cracks in its bark-like skin, and its eyes were the deep green of forest shadows. "You came back," it said in that voice, like distant thunder. "Let them go," I said, trying to keep my rifle steady. "They didn't hurt anything. They brought the iron poison." The creature gestured with one massive hand, and I saw what it meant. One of the hikers carried a small camping stove, the kind that ran on gas canisters. To the forest giant, even that tiny bit of technology was a threat to its ancient world. "They don't understand," I said. "They're just people trying to see the mountains. People always want to see, always want to take. First, the iron beasts, then the fire rivers. Soon, nothing old remains." Fire rivers. It was talking about the highways and power lines that were slowly creeping up the mountains, bringing development and destruction with them. The forest giant wasn't just protecting this one forest. It was fighting a war against the modern world itself. "What do you want?" I asked. The creature's eyes fixed on me with that terrible intelligence. "The old agreement must be renewed." "What agreement?" "Your people and mine. Long ago, your chiefs promised, leave the high places alone. We will not wake the deep sleepers." Jack stepped forward. "The Cherokee treaties. You're talking about boundaries set before white settlers came to these mountains. Boundaries. Broken. Promises. Forgotten. Now, the sleepers stir." As if to prove its point, the ground began to tremble. Not from the forest giant's footsteps, but from something deeper, something bigger. In the distance, I heard a sound like mountains grinding together, and the oak tree above us dropped leaves even though it was summer. "There are more of you," I said, finally understanding. "Many more. Sleeping in the deep places beneath the roots, but not sleeping much longer." The three hikers turned as one to look at us, their eyes still blank but now filled with something that wasn't entirely human. When they spoke, it was in unison, their voices echoing the forest giant's words. "Choose," they said together. "Keep the old promises, or face what sleeps below." I looked at Jack, at Jim, at the three possessed hikers, at the forest giant that loomed over us like a living mountain. 20 years of forestry training hadn't prepared me for this, but 20 years of living in these mountains had taught me one thing. Some promises are too important to break, even if you don't fully understand them. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "Close the trails. Keep your people away. Let the old places be old again." "And if I don't?" The forest giant smiled, showing teeth like broken stones. "Then you will meet what sleeps beneath the mountain roots, and your people will learn why the Cherokee called this place forbidden." The ground shook again, harder this time, and in the distance I could hear something answering the forest giant's call. Something big enough to make the mountain itself tremble. "I'll do it," I said quickly. "I'll close the trails. I'll make sure people stay away." The forest giant nodded once, and the three hikers suddenly blinked and looked around like they were waking up from a deep sleep. They didn't remember anything about being called into the forest, just that they'd felt like taking a walk and somehow gotten lost. We led them back to their campsite, and they packed up and left that same day, talking about how peaceful and beautiful the mountains were and how they couldn't wait to come back. I didn't have the heart to tell them they never would. That was 40 years ago, 40 years since I made a promise to something that shouldn't exist, in a forest that most people don't even know is there anymore. I kept my word. It took some doing, filing reports about geological instability, getting environmental impact studies done, calling in favors from politicians who owed me one. But slowly, piece by piece, I got the upper elevations of Black Balsam Knob designated as protected wilderness. No logging, no camping, no hiking trails. The official reason is unstable terrain and endangered plant species. The real reason is sleeping somewhere deep beneath the mountain roots, and I pray it stays that way. Jack Wissenhunt died 5 years ago, took his secrets with him to the grave. But before he passed, he taught his grandson Tommy everything his grandmother had taught him about the old places and the things that guard them. Tommy works for the Forest Service now, and he keeps an eye on Black Balsam just like his grandfather did, because the forest giant is still there. Oh, it doesn't show itself anymore, hasn't since that day in the clearing. But sometimes hikers report strange things. Trees that seem to move when you're not looking directly at them. Footsteps in the forest that are too heavy to be human. A feeling of being watched by something vast and patient and older than civilization. Most people dismiss these stories as imagination or too much time in the wilderness. But I know better. The forest giant is still keeping its side of the bargain, protecting the old places from anyone who might disturb them. And as long as we keep our side, as long as we leave the sacred spaces alone, it will continue to sleep. But development keeps creeping up the mountains. Every year there are more houses, more roads, more people who don't understand that some places are meant to stay wild. And every year I worry that someday someone will push too far into the protected areas and wake something that has been sleeping for centuries. Because the forest giant wasn't lying about the others. Sometimes on very quiet nights when the wind is just right, I can hear them tearing beneath the mountains. Ancient guardians that make the forest giant look small. Things that remember when the Cherokee first came to these mountains and found them already occupied. I'm 78 years old now, and I don't have many years left. When I'm gone, the job of keeping the old promises will fall to Tommy Wissenhunt and whoever comes after him. I hope they're strong enough and smart enough to understand what's at stake. Because if they're not, if we ever break faith with the guardians of the deep places, then everyone in these mountains will learn what the Cherokee learned long ago, that there are things in the world older than human memory, and some of them don't like being disturbed. The tourists who drive up to Black Balsam Knob these days see a beautiful mountain bald with spectacular views and wildflower meadows. They take their pictures and buy their postcards and drive back to their hotels thinking they've seen the real mountains. They have no idea how close they've come to something that could crush their cars like tin cans and throw their bodies into the next county. They don't know that every step they take on those grassy balds is watched by eyes that have seen centuries pass and measured by intelligence that judges not just their actions, but their intentions. Sometimes I think about telling my story, really telling it, writing it all down so people will understand why certain trails are closed, why certain areas are off limits, why the old Cherokee warnings should still be heeded. But who would believe an old ranger's tales of tree giants and sleeping mountains? They'd file it under folklore and forget about it by the next day. So instead, I keep quiet, and I keep watching, and I trust that the guardians of Black Balsam Knob will keep their bargain as long as we keep ours. The forest remembers everything, and it's still listening. From us. Somewhere in the deep places beneath the mountain roots, ancient things sleep fitfully and dream of a world where iron beasts and fire rivers never existed. I just hope they stay sleeping. But on nights when the wind howls through the high places and the mountains themselves seem to whisper warnings, I'm not so sure they will. My name is Robert Fairchild, and I've seen things in these mountains that would make you think twice about taking that next hiking trail or camping in that perfect meadow. The mountains are beautiful, but they're not empty, and they don't forget. My name is Gregory Blackburn, but everyone calls me Greg. I've been a ranger at Linville Gorge for 8 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. Boy, was I wrong. Let me tell you about Linville Gorge first. It's a place that takes your breath away. A canyon that drops 1,400 feet straight down, with walls made of white quartzite that shine like bone in the sunlight. The Cherokee used to call it the River of Many Cliffs, and they had stories about it that made my skin crawl. Stories I should have listened to. October is our busiest time. The leaves turn every color you can imagine, and people come from all over to see them. That's when the accidents happen most. Folks getting so caught up in the pretty views that they forget where they're walking. I've pulled more than 200 people off these cliffs over the years. Broken bones, heat stroke, people who took a wrong turn and couldn't find their way back. Normal stuff, if you can call it that. I always thought that's all it was. People making mistakes, getting lost because they didn't pay attention to the trail markers, maybe falling because they leaned too far over a ledge trying to get the perfect photo. I was 29, engaged to a girl named Sarah who worried every time I left for work. She wanted me to get a desk job, somewhere safe. I used to laugh and tell her that the mountains weren't dangerous if you knew what you were doing. That was before I learned what was really taking people in the gorge. It started on a Tuesday morning in late October. The leaves were at their peak, bright red and orange and yellow, like someone had set the whole forest on fire. I was checking the trail conditions near Table Rock when dispatch crackled over my radio. Greg, we've got 3 missing hikers, last seen yesterday around 4 p.m. heading toward the gorge trail. 3 hikers. That wasn't unusual. People got turned around all the time, especially when they were busy looking up at the trees instead of down at the path. I figured they'd probably spent the night somewhere dry and were walking out right about now, embarrassed and hungry. Copy that, I radioed back. Got their names and description? The Kowalski family from Charlotte. Dad's an experienced hiker, Eagle Scout. Mom's done rock climbing. Their daughter just turned 16. They had all the right gear. That made me pause. Experienced hikers with good equipment don't usually get lost overnight. But people make stupid mistakes when they're having fun with their family. Maybe they tried a shortcut or went off trail to get a better view. I hiked down to where they'd parked their car. It was still there, covered in morning dew. Everything looked normal. No signs of trouble, no broken windows, no blood. Just a blue Honda with North Carolina plates and a proud parent of an honor student sticker on the back. The trail they'd taken leads down into the gorge, winding through pine trees and over rocks worn smooth by a million years of rain. It's a good trail, well marked, not too hard if you take your time. I'd walked it hundreds of times, could probably do it blindfolded. But something felt wrong that morning. It was too quiet, really quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering, no bugs buzzing around my head. The kind of silence that makes you want to whisper. Even my boots seemed too loud on the rocky path. About a mile down, I found the first sign of them. A water bottle, the expensive kind that keeps drinks cold all day. It was sitting on a flat rock beside the trail, cap off, still half full, like someone had put it down and forgotten to pick it back up. That's when I noticed the smell, sweet and rotten, like fruit left in the sun too long. It was faint, just a hint on the breeze. But it made my stomach turn. I looked around for a dead animal, maybe a deer that had fallen and couldn't get back up, but didn't see anything. I picked up the water bottle and kept walking. The trail curved around a big boulder, and that's where things got really weird. Their backpacks were there, all 3 of them, sitting in a perfect line on the ground. Not dropped or thrown, but placed carefully, like someone had arranged them for a photograph. The zippers were all closed, nothing spilled out or messed up. I opened each one, checking for ID and clues. Everything was there. Food, first aid kit, extra clothes, camera, even their wallets with cash still inside. Nobody leaves that stuff behind on purpose, especially not people who know what they're doing in the woods. But it was what I found next to the backpacks that really made my hands shake. Footprints. Lots of them. But they weren't going up or down the trail like they should be. Instead, they led straight toward the cliff face, to a spot where the rock wall rose straight up for about 60 feet. The prints just stopped there, like the three hikers had walked up to the stone and, what, vanished? I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of it. The rational part of my brain, the part trained in search and rescue, said they must have doubled back somehow. Maybe they climbed up the rock face, though I couldn't see how. Even with ropes and gear, it would be a tough climb for experts. But the other part of my brain, the part that remembered my grandmother's stories about things that lived in dark places, was screaming at me to get out of there. The smell was getting stronger. I called for backup. Lisa Thornfield arrived about an hour later, rappelling down from the rim with enough gear to outfit an army. Lisa was the best technical rescue specialist we had. She could climb anything and had pulled people off cliffs that would make your knees weak just looking at them. "What have we got?" she asked, unclipping from her rope. I showed her the backpacks, the footprints, the water bottle. She crouched down and studied the tracks, following them with her finger like she was reading a book. "These are weird," she said. "Look at this. All three sets of prints are exactly the same depth, same length of stride, like they were walking in step with each other." That sent a chill down my spine. Maybe they were holding hands? Staying together? Maybe. But she didn't sound convinced. We searched the area for 2 hours, calling their names, checking every crack and crevice in the rock. Nothing. It was like the gorge had swallowed them whole. That's when Lisa found the cave. She was examining the cliff face where the footprints ended, running her hands over the stone, when her fingers found empty air. Behind a curtain of hanging moss and dripping water, there was an opening. Not big, maybe 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, but definitely a cave. "Greg, come look at this." I crawled over and peered into the darkness. The opening led back into the mountain, curving out of sight after just a few feet. Cool air drifted out, carrying that sweet, sick smell I'd been noticing all morning. "Think they went in there?" Lisa asked. "Only one way to find out." We got our headlamps and crawled inside. The tunnel was tight for the first 10 feet, then opened up into a larger chamber. Our lights played across smooth stone walls and a floor covered in fine sand. And there, clear as day, were more footprints. But these prints were different, deeper. And there were more of them, dozens of bare feet, all heading deeper into the mountain. "Jesus," Lisa whispered. "How many people are down here?" We followed the prints through twisting passages and down natural stone steps. The cave was bigger than any I'd seen in the area, with rooms that opened up into cathedral-sized spaces and tunnels that branched off in every direction. Our voices echoed strangely, like the rock was somehow, allowing some sounds and amplifying others. That's when we started hearing the whispers. At first I thought it was just echoes of our own breathing, or maybe wind moving through the cave system. But as we got deeper, the sounds became clearer. Voices. Lots of them. All speaking at the same time, but too far away to understand the words. "You hearing this?" I asked Lisa. She nodded, her face pale in the headlamp light. "We should go back, call for a full cave rescue team." But we didn't go back. Something kept pulling us forward, like an invisible rope around our chests. We had to find those hikers. We had to know what happened to them. The tunnel opened into the biggest underground room I'd ever seen. Our lights couldn't reach the ceiling or the far walls. Stone formations rose from the floor like frozen waterfalls, and pools of black water reflected our headlamps like mirrors. And on the walls, everywhere we looked, were paintings. Not recent graffiti or tourist scratches. These were old. Really old. Painted in what looked like red clay and charcoal, showing stick figures with hollow circles where their eyes should be. The figures were holding hands, dancing around what might have been a fire. And in the center of each painting was something that made my blood run cold. A tall figure with long arms and legs, surrounded by smaller ones. All of them had the same empty eye sockets, but the big one had something else. Lines radiating out from its head like a crown, or maybe like the roots of a tree growing backward. "Cherokee," Lisa said quietly. "These have to be Cherokee cave paintings." "Yeah, but what do they mean?" Before she could answer, we heard footsteps. Not echoes of our own feet, but actual footsteps coming from somewhere deeper in the cave. Slow, measured steps, like someone walking in rhythm. And with each step, the whispers got louder. We turned off our headlamps and stood perfectly still in the darkness. The footsteps got closer, and now we could hear breathing. Not normal breathing, the kind of long, slow breaths you take when you're sleeping. A light appeared in one of the tunnel openings across the chamber. Not electric light, but something warmer and flickering, like a torch or candle. As it got closer, we could make out shapes moving behind it. People. 3 of them, walking in single file. The Kowalskis, Lisa breathed. But something was wrong with them. They moved too slowly, like they were walking underwater. Their clothes were dirty and torn, and they stared straight ahead without blinking. And their eyes. God, their eyes. Where the eyes should have been were just dark holes, like someone had scooped them out with a spoon. But they weren't bleeding or infected. The holes were perfectly round and smooth, like they'd been born that way. The 3 figures walked past us without looking in our direction, even though we were standing right in the open. They just kept walking, following the painted figures on the walls, heading deeper into the cave. Lisa grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. We have to get out of here. Now. But as we turned to leave, we heard something that stopped us cold. More footsteps. Lots of them. Coming from every tunnel, every passage, every dark corner of the chamber. Dozens of people, all walking at the same pace, all breathing in perfect rhythm. And they were coming toward us. We ran. Lisa led the way, her headlamp bouncing wildly as we scrambled through the narrow passages. Behind us, the footsteps kept coming. Never faster, never slower. Just that steady walking pace that somehow seemed more terrifying than if they'd been chasing us at a full sprint. This way, Lisa gasped, turning down a tunnel I didn't remember from our trip in. Are you sure? No, but it's going up. We climbed over rocks and squeezed through cracks that scraped our shoulders raw. The sounds behind us never faded, never got farther away. If anything, they seemed to be coming from ahead of us now, too, like we were being surrounded. I kept thinking about those empty eye sockets, how smooth they were, how the people with them had moved like sleepwalkers, but somehow knew exactly where. They were going in the dark. Lisa, stop. I grabbed her backpack. We need to think about this. Think about what? Those things back there? They're not things. They're people, the Kowalskis, and who knows how many others. She turned around, and in the light from her headlamp I could see tears streaming down her face. Greg, they don't have eyes. They don't have fucking eyes. I'd never heard Lisa swear before. In 8 years of working together, through every kind of emergency you could imagine, she'd never lost her cool. That scared me more than anything we'd seen so far. We need to find another way out, I said. There has to be more than one entrance to a cave system this big. We kept moving, trying to stay quiet. But the sound of our breathing seemed to echo everywhere. And always, just at the edge of hearing, were those footsteps. The tunnel we were in started to widen, and soon we could stand up straight again. The walls were different here, smoother, like they'd been worked by human hands. And there were more paintings, lots more. These showed the same hollow-eyed figures, but now they were doing things, hunting, building, and in every picture they were bringing people to the tall figure with the crown of lines, people with normal eyes who struggled and fought. But in the next panel, those same people would be shown with empty sockets, walking calmly alongside the others. It's a process, Lisa whispered. Whatever this is, it's a process. What kind of process? I don't know, but look at this. She was pointing to a section of wall covered in tally marks. Thousands of them, scratched into the stone with something sharp. At the bottom, in letters that looked more recent, someone had carved words in English. They take your eyes and keep your soul. Below that, in what looked like a child's handwriting, help us. My radio crackled to life, making us both jump. The sound was distorted, full of static, but I could make out a voice. Greg! Lisa! Where are you? I keyed the mic. This is Blackburn. We're in the cave system below the gorge trail. We need backup. Full rescue team. Something's wrong down here. Static. Then, Greg, come deeper. It's wonderful down here. The voice was mine. My own voice, coming through the radio, telling us to go deeper into the cave. Lisa yanked the radio out of my hand and threw it against the wall. It shattered, pieces scattering across the stone floor. That wasn't you, she said. I know. That was your voice, but that wasn't you. I know. We heard singing. It was coming from everywhere at once, voices blending together in harmony. The words were in a language I didn't recognize, but the melody was beautiful. Sad and beautiful, like a lullaby someone might sing to a child who was having nightmares. Against every instinct I had, I wanted to follow that singing. It felt like the most natural thing in the world to walk toward those voices, to join in the song. My feet started moving before I realized what was happening. Lisa slapped me. Hard. Don't listen to it, she said. Whatever you do, don't listen. The singing got louder, and now I could see lights moving in the tunnels around us. Not the warm, flickering light we'd seen before, but the cold white glow of LED headlamps. Our headlamps. The ones we'd been wearing when we came down here. But we were still wearing our headlamps. A figure stepped out of one of the side passages. It was me. I mean, it looked exactly like me. Same uniform, same gear, same face. But its eyes were gone, replaced by those perfect round holes. It raised its hand in greeting, and when it spoke, the voice was definitely mine. Greg, there you are. We've been looking for you everywhere. Another figure appeared behind the first. Lisa, same uni. Form. Same blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, same scar on her chin from a climbing accident 3 years ago, but hollow where her eyes should be. The Cherokee were right, the Lisa thing said. This place is sacred. The Hollow Men live here, and they've been waiting so long for us to join them. They're not us, I said, backing away. Of course we are, said my doppelganger. We're who you're going to be, who you want to be. No more worry, no more fear, no more pain. Just peace. More figures emerged from the darkness. Other rangers I recognized, hikers who'd gone missing over the years, people I'd searched for and never found. All of them walking calmly, all of them with those terrible smooth holes where their eyes used to be. How many? Lisa whispered. I tried to count, but they kept coming. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. Men, women, children, some in modern hiking gear, others in clothes that looked decades old. All of them moving with that same underwater slowness. All of them smiling with perfect, empty sockets. And behind them, taller than the rest, was the figure from the cave paintings. It had to duck to fit through the tunnel, its arms hanging almost to its knees. The crown of lines around its head weren't painted on. They were real, like scars carved deep into its skull. When it spoke, all the other voices spoke with it, creating a sound like wind through a forest. You have seen our home, it said. You have walked our paths. Now you must stay. Like hell, I said. I grabbed Lisa's hand and ran straight at the wall of hollow-eyed people. They didn't try to stop us, just watched with those empty sockets as we pushed through them. Their skin was cold and dry, like touching old leather. We made it about 50 feet before Lisa screamed. I turned around and saw her stumbling, one hand pressed to her face. Between her fingers, blood was seeping out. My eye, she gasped. Something's wrong with my eye. I pulled her hand away and nearly threw up. Her right eye was gone. Not torn out or injured, just gone, like it had never been there. The socket was perfectly round and smooth, just like all the others. Lisa, we have to go. Now. But she wasn't listening. She was staring at something I couldn't see, smiling that same calm smile I'd seen on all the other faces. It doesn't hurt, she said. Greg, it doesn't hurt at all. It's actually kind of nice. She took a step toward the crowd of hollow-eyed figures, and I knew I was losing her. I tackled Lisa before she could take another step, pinning her to the ground. She didn't fight me, just looked up with one normal eye and one empty socket, still wearing that peaceful smile. "Let me go, Greg. I want to join them." "No, you don't. That's not you talking." "Of course it's me. I've never been more myself." I looked around at the crowd of hollow figures watching us. They weren't coming closer, just standing there patiently, like they had all the time in the world. Maybe they did. The tall figure with the crown of scars stepped forward. Up close, I could see that it had been human once. The bone structure was wrong now, stretched and elongated, but underneath I could make out what might have been Cherokee features. Its voice was like grinding stone. "She understands now. The fear is gone. The pain is gone. Only peace remains." "What are you?" "We are the Hollow Men. We were here when your people came, when they built their trails and their towns on our sacred places. We tried to warn them, but they would not listen. You're killing them. We are saving them. Your world is full of suffering. Here there is no hunger, no loneliness, no death. Only the eternal dance." As it spoke, the hollow-eyed figures around us began to move in slow circles, holding hands, swaying to music I couldn't hear. Lisa tried to get up and join them, but I held her down. "The Cherokee knew," the creature continued. "They left offerings, stayed away from our tunnels. But then the settlers came, and the hikers, and the climbers. So many lost souls, wandering in the darkness above. We gave them light." I thought about all the missing person reports over the years. All the search and rescue operations that turned up nothing. All the families who never got answers. How long has this been going on? Time has no meaning here. We have danced since the mountains were young. Lisa had stopped struggling. She was humming along with whatever music the Hollow Men were hearing, her face completely relaxed. When she looked at me, there was no recognition in her remaining eye. "Lisa, listen to me. You're a ranger. You help people. You've saved lives." "I'm saving you now," she said. "Can't you see how beautiful this is?" The truth hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't some ancient evil or supernatural curse. It was a parasite, a mental parasite that had been living in these caves for generations, feeding on human consciousness. The Cherokee hadn't worshipped it. They'd contained it, kept people away from it, tried to starve it out. But when European settlers came, they didn't listen to the warnings. They saw a gorge full of beautiful views and hiking trails. They brought tourists and thrill-seekers and people looking for adventure. All that fresh consciousness, walking right into the parasite's territory. The creature was still talking, explaining its philosophy of peace through emptiness. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was looking at the cave walls, at the paintings, trying to understand how the Cherokee had kept this thing trapped for so long. Then I saw it. In the older paintings, the ones done in different colors, the Hollow Men weren't dancing. They were confined to the deepest parts of the cave, surrounded by symbols that looked like barriers or walls. The Cherokee hadn't worshipped this thing. They'd been its prison guards. And something had broken the prison open. "The hiking trails," I said out loud. "What?" The creature's attention turned to me. "You said the Cherokee kept you contained, but in the last 50 years we've been building trails right over your territory, opening up new entrances, letting you spread." The thing that had once been Cherokee smiled, and I could see broken teeth in its elongated skull. "Your people are so generous. They build roads to bring us food." That's when I made my decision. I had maybe 30 seconds before Lisa's other eye went dark, and she became one of them permanently. 30 seconds before I became another hollow-eyed dancer in an endless underground ballroom. The Cherokee had used cave-ins to contain this thing. That's what all those barrier symbols meant. They'd collapsed tunnels, sealed off sections, kept the parasite from spreading, and they'd passed down the knowledge through stories and warnings that nobody listened to anymore. I still had the demolition charges in my pack. Standard equipment for rangers. Sometimes you had to blast away fallen rocks to reach trapped hikers. I'd never thought I'd use them for something like this. "Hey," I called to the tall creature. "You want to show me something really beautiful?" It tilted its elongated head, curious. I pulled the pin on the first charge and threw it as far as I could into the crowd of hollow men. Then the second. Then the third. 10 seconds, I yelled at Lisa, hoping some part of her was still in there. She blinked her remaining eye, and for just a moment, I saw confusion replace the peaceful emptiness. I grabbed her and ran toward the nearest tunnel as the charges went off. The explosion brought down half the mountain. We barely made it to the surface before the tunnels collapsed behind us, sealing the hollow men in their underground prison. Lisa and I crawled out of that hidden cave entrance just as the ground started shaking, dirt and rocks raining down around us. I carried her up the gorge trail while she screamed. The peaceful emptiness was gone, and she was feeling everything the parasite had taken away. The pain of her missing eye, the terror of what had happened to her, the knowledge of what she'd almost become. The official report said it was a cave-in, a natural, geological event that sealed off an unstable underground chamber. The 3 missing hikers were declared dead, victims of the collapse. Their bodies were never found. Lisa retired 2 weeks later. The doctors fitted her with a prosthetic eye, and she moved back to Ohio to live with her sister. She doesn't return my calls. I lasted another month before I couldn't take it anymore. Every time I looked at the gorge, I could hear that singing. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those smooth, empty sockets. I requested a transfer to a desk job in Asheville, processing permits and filing reports. Sarah was happy about the transfer at first. She thought it meant I'd be safer. But then she started noticing things. How I couldn't sleep without all the lights on. How I jumped at every unexpected sound. How I wouldn't go hiking anymore. Wouldn't even walk in the woods behind our house. We broke up 6 months ago. She said I wasn't the same person she'd fallen in love with. She was right. I still think about those caves. The official records show that Linville Gorge has had 47 unexplained disappearances over the past 60 years. 47 people who walked into the woods and never came back out. But I know the real number is higher, much higher. Because sometimes, after heavy rains, new cave entrances appear in the gorge. Park rangers find them and report them and seal them off for safety, but there are always more. The hollow men are still down there, waiting in the dark, and the parasite that controls them is patient. It's been learning from every mind it's consumed, learning about our world, our technology, our weaknesses, and eventually, it's going to find a way out that can't be stopped with explosives and cave-ins. Last week, a family of 4 went missing near Table Rock. Their car was found in the parking area, all their belongings still inside. The search and rescue team looked for 3 days before calling it off. I wanted to warn them. I picked up the phone a dozen times to call the ranger station and tell them what they were really looking for. But who would believe me? And what if Lisa was wrong? What if some part of the thing's influence was still in my head, trying to get me to lead more people down into the dark? So I said nothing, and 4 more people joined the eternal dance. I've started having dreams about hollow eyes again. Sometimes I wake up and rush to the bathroom mirror, terrified that I'll see empty sockets staring back at me. So far, my eyes are still there, still working, still seeing things I wish I could forget. But I know it's only a matter of time. The hollow men are patient, but they never forget. And once you've been in their caves, once you've heard their song, you belong to them forever. The Cherokee had a saying, "Some hungers can never be satisfied, only contained." I don't think we've contained this one. I think we've just made it angry. And late at night, when the wind blows through the gorge, I swear I can still hear them singing. If you ever find yourself hiking in Linville Gorge and you hear beautiful music coming from somewhere underground, don't listen. Don't follow it. And whatever you do, don't look directly at anyone you meet on the trails. Sometimes, the eyes you think you see aren't really there at all. My name is Catherine Moorfield, but everyone calls me Kate. I've been a park ranger at Grandfather Mountain for 11 years now, and I thought I knew every animal that lived in these North Carolina woods. I have a PhD in zoology and spent most of my adult life studying wildlife. Bears, deer, wildcats. I've tracked them all. I even wrote papers about them for science journals. But I was wrong about knowing everything in these mountains. It was September 1982, and the leaves were just starting to turn orange and red. Tourists came from all over to see the fall colors, especially up at the mile-high swinging bridge. That's where the trouble started. A family from Tennessee showed me some pictures they took near Rough Ridge Trail. At first I thought it was just shadows between the trees, but when I looked closer with my magnifying glass, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There was a figure standing behind a big oak tree, tall, covered in dark fur, watching the family take their photos. "Ma'am, what do you think that is?" the father asked me. I handed back the photos, trying to keep my voice steady. "Probably just a black bear standing up to get a better look around. They do that sometimes." But I was lying. In 11 years of studying bears, I'd never seen one that tall. This thing had to be at least 8 feet, maybe more. And the way it stood, too much like a person. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those pictures. The next morning, I drove out to my research station, a small cabin about 2 miles from the nearest hiking trail. I use it to study animal behavior and track wildlife movements. It's quiet out there. The perfect place to think. As I walked the trail to Rough Ridge, something felt wrong. The forest was too quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. Even the wind seemed to whisper instead of blow. After 20 minutes of hiking, I found the spot where the family took their pictures. I set up my camera equipment and started looking for signs, footprints, broken branches, anything that might tell me what they really saw. That's when I found them. Hair samples caught on a thorn bush, long, coarse hair that was reddish-brown, almost rust-colored. I carefully put them in a plastic bag and labeled it. Back at the station, I looked at them under my microscope. They didn't match anything in my reference books. Not bear hair, not deer, not any animal I knew lived in North Carolina. I should have stopped there. I should have sent the samples to the state lab and waited for their report. But I was curious, and curiosity has always been my weakness. Over the next few days, I kept going back to that area. I set up trail cameras, hoping to catch whatever it was on film. But every morning, I'd check the cameras and find the same thing. Hours of static, like something was interfering with the signal. On the 4th day, I found the footprint. It was in the soft mud beside Boone Fork Creek, about a mile from where the family saw their bear. The print was 18 inches long and looked almost human, except for the size and the long toes. I took photos from every angle and made a plaster cast. That night, I called my research partner, Dr. James Whitlock. He worked at the university and helped me with my bear studies. "Jim, I need you to come up here and look at something." "What kind of something, Kate?" I stared at the plaster cast sitting on my kitchen table. Something that shouldn't exist. Jim arrived the next morning with his usual smile and a thermos of coffee. He was 10 years older than me, with gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. We'd worked together for 5 years, and he never made fun of my ideas, even the crazy ones. "So, what's got you so worked up?" he asked, setting his equipment bag on my porch. I showed him the photos first, then the hair samples, and finally the plaster cast. His smile faded as he studied each piece of evidence. "Kate, this is..." He picked up the cast and turned it over in his hands. "This can't be real." That's what I thought. But look at the detail in the footprint. See how deep it is? Whatever made this weighs at least 600 pounds, probably more. And look at the stride length in the photos, 8 feet between prints. Jim was quiet for a long time. Finally he said, "We need to go back to where you found this." We hiked out to the creek together. The morning was beautiful, with sunlight filtering through the yellow leaves. But as we got closer to the spot, that strange quiet settled over the forest again. No animal sounds at all. "You feel that?" I whispered. Jim nodded, like everything's holding its breath. We found more footprints along the creek bank. Jim took measurements while I searched for more hair samples. We worked in silence, both of us focused on documenting everything we could find. That's when we saw the trees. About 50 yards upstream, several large oaks had been bent over and twisted together, forming what looked like a shelter or nest about 12 feet off the ground. The trees weren't broken. They were bent, like something incredibly strong had shaped them on purpose. "Kate, come look at this." Jim was kneeling beside one of the twisted trees, running his hand along the trunk. Deep gouges ran down the bark, 4 parallel lines like claw marks, but too big for any animal I knew. "Whatever did this has hands," he said quietly. "Look at the thumb mark here." I felt cold, despite the warm September air. "We need to measure everything and get out of here." But as I said it, we heard something that made us both freeze. A low, rumbling sound, like a growl, but deeper. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the trees. "Jim," I whispered, "back to the truck, now." We packed our equipment as quickly as we could, trying not to make any sudden movements. The growling stopped, but I could feel something watching us. The hair on my arm stood up, and every instinct told me to run. We made it back to my research station without incident, but both of us were shaken. Jim helped me organize all our evidence while I made notes in my field journal. "Kate, what if this is real?" he asked. "What if there really is something out there?" Before I could answer, we heard a sound that made us both jump. Something hit the side of the cabin, hard. We ran to the window and looked out, but saw nothing except trees swaying in the wind. Then we heard it again. This time we saw a large rock bounce off a tree about 20 feet away. I grabbed my binoculars and scanned the tree line. "There," I whispered, handing Jim the binoculars. "Behind that big pine." Jim adjusted the focus and went very still. After a moment, he lowered the binoculars and looked at me with wide eyes. "Kate, we need to call this in. Right now." "What did you see?" "Eyes. Big, dark eyes. And they were watching us." We spent that evening trying to decide what to do. Jim wanted to contact the state wildlife department immediately. I wanted to gather more evidence first. We finally agreed to spend one more day investigating, then make our report. We should have called that night. The next morning, Jim didn't show up at the station. I waited until noon, then drove to his hotel in Banner Elk. The desk clerk said he'd checked out early that morning, but hadn't said where he was going. I tried calling his cell phone, but there was no answer. A bad feeling settled in my stomach as I drove back to Grandfather Mountain. Jim wouldn't just leave without telling me. I found his rental car parked at the Rough Ridge trailhead. The driver's door was open and his camera bag sat on the passenger seat. But Jim was nowhere to be found. I called his name as I followed the trail toward the Sulwa Creek. No answer. The forest was dead quiet again, like it had been the day before. I found his notebook about halfway to the creek, pages scattered by the wind. That's when I saw the blood. Drops of blood led from the scattered notebook pages deeper into the forest, away from any trail. I followed them, calling Jim's name and trying to stay calm. But my hands were shaking as I held my radio. "Base, this is Ranger Moorfield. I need backup at Rough Ridge Trail. Possible missing hiker." The radio crackled. "Copy, Kate. What's the situation?" "I found an abandoned vehicle and signs of trouble. Send a search team." "On the way. ETA 20 minutes. 20 minutes felt like forever. I kept following the blood trail, taking photos and marking the path with orange flagging tape. The drops led to a small clearing I'd never seen before, even after 11 years in these mountains. In the center of the clearing was a circle of stones, arranged too perfectly to be natural. Dark stains covered the rocks, and the smell hit me like a punch to the gut. Metallic, sour, wrong. I found Jim's glasses beside the stone circle. One lens was cracked, and the frames were bent. But no sign of Jim. The search team arrived and spent 3 days looking for him. We used dogs, helicopters, and dozens of volunteers. But Grandfather Mountain had swallowed Jim Whitlock without a trace. The official report said he probably fell into a ravine or got lost in the wilderness. Accidents happen, even to experienced hikers. Case closed, but I knew better. A week after Jim disappeared, I went back to my research station alone. I had to know what we were really dealing with. I brought extra cameras, motion sensors, and my grandfather's old hunting rifle, just in case. That first night, nothing happened. I sat by the window with the rifle across my lap, watching the tree line until my eyes hurt. Just before dawn, I must have dozed off. I woke up to find all my equipment had been moved. The cameras I'd set up around the cabin were now stacked in a neat pile on my porch. The motion sensors sat beside them, completely undamaged, but clearly placed there on purpose. Whatever did this was smart enough to know what the equipment was for. Inside the cabin, I found something that made my blood run cold. Muddy footprints crossed my floor, the same 18-inch prints I'd found by the creek, but these led to my bedroom door and stopped. Something had stood there, watching me sleep. I radioed for backup again, but when the other rangers arrived, they just saw muddy footprints. No big deal. Probably some kids playing pranks, they said. But kids don't have feet that big, and kids don't stack expensive camera equipment like toys. For the next week, I tried to go back to normal. I filed reports, guided tourist groups, and pretended everything was fine. But every night, I dreamed about Jim's broken glasses and those dark eyes watching from the trees. Then the other sightings started. A family camping at Price Lake saw a giant man walk through their campsite at 3 a.m. A hiker on the Tanawa Trail found huge footprints that led to a cliff face and just stopped. 2 rock climbers reported seeing something impossible, a massive figure climbing the sheer granite walls of Rough Ridge without ropes or equipment. The park superintendent wanted to ignore the reports. "Tourists see bears and think they're monsters," he said. "Don't encourage them." But I couldn't ignore what happened next. I was hiking the Grandfather Trail alone, checking on trail conditions after a storm. It was late afternoon, and the shadows were getting long. About a mile from the summit, I stopped to rest and drink some water. That's when I heard it. A sound I'll never forget. It started as a low whistle, almost musical. Then it grew louder and deeper, becoming something between a howl and a roar. The sound seemed to come from all directions, echoing off the rock walls and filling the entire valley. Every bird in the forest went quiet. Even the insects stopped buzzing. I grabbed my radio, but it was dead. Just static. I tried my cell phone. No signal. I was alone on the mountain with something that could make the entire forest fall silent. The howling stopped suddenly, and in the quiet that followed, I heard something worse. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming up the trail behind me. I turned around and saw nothing, but the footsteps kept coming, getting closer. I could hear branches breaking under enormous weight, but I couldn't see what was making the sounds. I ran. I've never been so scared in my life. I ran up that trail like something out of a nightmare was chasing me, which maybe it was. Behind me, the invisible footsteps kept pace, never getting closer but never falling behind. I made it to the parking area just as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. My truck sat alone under the broken streetlight, looking like salvation. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the lock. Just as I opened the door, something hit the truck bed with a metallic clang. I spun around and saw a boulder the size of a watermelon sitting where it had landed. The nearest cliff was at least 100 yards away. Nothing could throw a rock that size that distance. Nothing human, anyway. I drove home with my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, checking my mirrors every few seconds. In the darkness behind me, I swore I could see 2 large eyes reflecting my taillights. That night, I called my sister in Charlotte. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." "What's wrong, Kate? You sound terrible." "Do you think I'm losing my mind?" There was a long pause. "Why would you ask that?" I told her everything. The photos, the footprints, Jim's disappearance, the impossible things I'd been seeing. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Kate, maybe you should take some vacation time. Come visit me for a while." "So you think I'm crazy?" "I think you're under a lot of stress, and stress can make us see things that aren't there." But I knew what I'd seen was real, and I was going to prove it. The next morning, I drove to Cherokee to visit the tribal museum. If something that big was living in these mountains, the Cherokee would have stories about it. They'd been here long before any white settlers arrived. An elderly Cherokee man named Joseph Crow Feather worked as a guide at the museum. When I told him what I was looking for, his face got very serious. "You've seen the Guardian," he said quietly. "Guardian? Come with me." He led me to a storage room behind the main exhibits and pulled out an old wooden box. Inside were dozens of photographs and documents, some so old the paper was yellow and brittle. "My grandfather told these stories, and his grandfather before him," Joseph said, handling the papers carefully. "There have always been guardians in the sacred places. They protect the mountain from those who would harm it." He showed me drawings that made my heart stop. Tall, human-like figures covered in dark fur, standing among the trees of Grandfather Mountain. Some of the drawings were hundreds of years old. "They usually avoid humans," Joseph continued, "but if someone threatens their territory or their family, they will defend it." "Family?" "There are several living on Grandfather Mountain, have been for generations. They're intelligent, more than most people realize, and they're very protective of their young." I thought about Jim, about his broken glasses beside that stone circle. "What happens if someone gets too close?" Joseph's expression grew dark. "The Guardian decides if they're a threat. If they are." He didn't finish the sentence. I drove back to Grandfather Mountain with a new understanding. This wasn't just some unknown animal. It was a family of intelligent beings protecting their home. And Jim and I had stumbled into their territory. With cameras and measuring equipment, acting like researchers instead of visitors. But I had to know what happened to Jim. That evening, I returned to my research station one last time. I brought no cameras, no scientific equipment, just a small gift, a bag of apples from my grocery trip. Joseph had told me the Guardians appreciated offerings of food, especially fruit. I placed the apples on a tree stump about 50 yards from the cabin and sat on my porch to wait. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky orange and purple. For the first time in weeks, the forest didn't feel threatening. As darkness fell, I heard them coming. Footsteps in the trees, multiple sets moving carefully through the undergrowth. They circled the cabin slowly, and I caught glimpses of massive shadows between the trees. I stayed very still, trying to show I wasn't a threat. Finally, one of them stepped into the small clearing in front of my cabin. It was enormous, at least 10 feet tall and covered in thick reddish-brown fur. Its face was like a mixture of human and ape, with intelligent dark eyes that studied me carefully. It moved with surprising grace for something so large, each step deliberate and controlled. Behind it, I could see two others watching from the tree line. One was smaller, maybe 8 feet tall. The other looked young, staying close to what I assumed was its mother. A family, just like Joseph had said. The large one, the Guardian, picked up the bag of apples and examined it. Then it looked directly at me and nodded once, a clearly human gesture. I stood up slowly, keeping my hands visible. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "I didn't know this was your home." The Guardian tilted its head, listening. It seemed to understand. "My friend," I continued, "the man with glasses. What happened to him?" The Guardian's expression changed, becoming sad somehow. It walked to the edge of the forest and gestured for me to follow. Against every survival instinct I had, I went with it. The Guardian led me through the dark forest, moving silently despite its massive size. We walked for what felt like an hour, going deeper into the mountains than I'd ever been. Finally, we arrived at a hidden valley I never knew existed. In the center of the valley was a cave, and beside the cave was a small mound of stones. Flowers had been placed on top of the stones, mountain laurel and rhododendron blossoms. It was a grave. The Guardian watched as I approached the stone mound. Beside it, I found Jim's notebook and his favorite pen. Someone had arranged them carefully, respectfully. I looked up at the Guardian, tears in my eyes. He was my friend. The creature made a low, mournful sound. Then it did something I'll never forget. It placed one enormous hand gently on my shoulder, a gesture of comfort and apology. Through gestures and expressions, the Guardian told me what happened. Jim had returned to the forest alone, trying to set up cameras near their family's den. The Guardian had tried to warn him away, but Jim was scared and ran. In his panic, he fell from a cliff and broke his neck. The guardian had found him and brought him to this peaceful place, burying him with the respect one shows a lost traveler. They weren't monsters. They were people, in their own way. I spent an hour at Jim's grave, saying goodbye to my friend and colleague. When I was ready to leave, the guardian led me back toward the forest edge. At the boundary of their territory, it stopped and looked at me one final time. I understood. This was goodbye. I was welcome to leave, but I couldn't come back. This was their home, and they'd shown me more mercy than they'd probably shown anyone in generations. I submitted my final report to the Park Service the next week. Equipment malfunction and human error was my official explanation for the strange readings and unexplained phenomena. Dr. James Whitlock had died in an unfortunate hiking accident. Case closed, but I didn't stay. Every day at work reminded me of what I knew and couldn't tell anyone. 3 months later, I resigned from the Park Service and moved to Colorado. I still study wildlife, but now I work for a private research organization that investigates unusual animal sightings. Officially, I'm a cryptozoologist, a scientist who studies hidden animals. Unofficially, I help people understand when they've encountered something beyond normal science. The Cherokee were right about guardians living in sacred places. Over the years, I've found evidence of similar families throughout the Appalachian Mountains. They're always protective of their territory, always intelligent, and always misunderstood by the humans who occasionally cross their paths. I've learned to recognize the signs: wildlife avoiding certain areas, unexplained sounds in the forest, and the feeling of being watched by intelligent eyes. When hikers bring me photos of strange bears or stories about impossibly large footprints, I know what they've really seen. Most of the time, I can convince them to leave these families alone. Sometimes I can't. Last month, a logging company in West Virginia found enormous footprints near their worksite. The local news picked up the story, calling it a Bigfoot sighting and bringing tourists and monster hunters from across the country. I drove out there and met with the local Cherokee Tribal Council. They knew what was happening. Another guardian family was being threatened by human encroachment on their ancient territory. "What can we do?" I asked them. An elderly woman shook her head sadly. "The same thing our people have always done when the outside world gets too close. We adapt, we protect what we can, and we remember." The logging company abandoned their project 2 weeks later. Their equipment kept malfunctioning, workers reported feeling watched, and several people quit after finding their machinery had been mysteriously moved overnight. The official reports blamed environmental activists and equipment failures, but I knew the truth. The guardians reprotecting their home the same way they always had. Sometimes I dream about Grandfather Mountain and wonder if that family is still living peacefully in their hidden valley. I like to think they are. Joseph Crowfeather sends me updates occasionally. No more strange sightings, no more unexplained incidents. The tourists come and go, never knowing they're sharing the mountain with beings far older and wiser than themselves. I never go back to North Carolina. I made a promise at the edge of that forest, and I intend to keep it. But sometimes, when I'm researching other sightings in other mountains, I find myself hoping that more people will learn what I learned in that dark valley. Some things are meant to stay hidden. Some places deserve more respect than we usually give them. And sometimes, the monsters in our stories are just families trying to protect their children from a world that would never understand them. If you're ever hiking in the mountains and feel like something is watching you from the trees, remember Jim Whitlock. Show respect, leave no trace, and maybe leave a small offering of fruit on a tree stump before you go, because the guardians are still out there, still protecting the places we've forgotten are sacred, and they have very long memories. My name is Harold Ridgway, but everyone called me Hal. I spent 22 years working as a ranger on Roan Mountain, watching over those beautiful grassy hills that stretch between Tennessee and North Carolina. At 51, I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. I was wrong. March of 1959 was a tough month. Winter wouldn't let go, and snow kept us cut off from the main roads. My fire tower sat 8 miles from the nearest help, perched up on the bald at over 6,000 feet. From up there you could see for miles in every direction, rolling green hills covered in grass instead of trees, like someone had laid a giant carpet over the mountaintops. I'd been married to Martha for 25 years, had 3 kids all grown up and moved away. Served in the war too, saw plenty of bad things over in France. Point is, I wasn't some kid who jumped at shadows. When you've been watching fires for as long as I had, you learn to tell the difference between real danger and your imagination playing tricks. The Cherokee used to call this place the Mountain of Screaming Winds. White settlers who came later had their own stories about banshees wailing in the night. I always figured those were just mountain lions or the wind howling through the gaps. Turns out I should have listened to the old stories. My job was simple enough. Watch for fires, call them in, help coordinate the crews who came to put them out. I had my Osborne Firefinder, a compass-like device that helped me pinpoint exactly where smoke was coming from. Good binoculars, weather instruments, radio equipment, everything I needed to do my job right. The trouble started on March 15th. I was doing my morning check, scanning the horizon like I did every day for the past 2 decades. That's when I saw the first smoke plume, rising thin and straight about 5 miles south. Nothing unusual there. Dry conditions, old lightning strike maybe, or someone's campfire got out of hand. But as I reached for my radio to call it in, I spotted another column of smoke. This one was about 3 miles east. Then another, north by northwest. Within 10 minutes, I was looking at 6 separate fires scattered across the mountain range in what looked like, well, it looked like a pattern. "Base, this is Roan Tower," I called on my radio. "Got multiple fires burning. Looks organized." "Copy, Roan Tower. Organized how?" I squinted through my binoculars, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. They're arranged in a rough circle around the main bald, about 10 miles across. Arsonist? Maybe. But who could move that fast? These fires all started within minutes of each other. Captain Buck Morrison's voice crackled through the speaker. Buck was a good man, ran the fire suppression crew for our district. We'd worked together for 15 years. "We're loading up now, Hal. Keep an eye on those blazes and guide us in." That's when I noticed something else. The birds were gone. Not just quiet, but gone completely. In all my years on that mountain, I'd never seen the sky so empty. Even the crows, who would stick around through anything, had vanished. The only sound was wind rustling through the grass. I spent the rest of that day directing Buck's crew from fire to fire. Each one was small, maybe half an acre, burning clean and controlled. Too controlled. Natural fires spread wild, follow the wind and fuel. These burned in perfect circles, like someone had drawn them with a compass. Buck radioed up around sunset. "Hal, you need to see this." "What is it?" "These burn patterns. They ain't natural. Come down here." I locked up the tower and hiked down to where Buck's crew was mopping up the closest fire site. What I saw there made my skin crawl. The fire hadn't just burned the grass away. It had burned marks into the bare earth underneath. Symbols, like the Cherokee used to carve on rocks. Spirals and lines that hurt to look at too long. "What do you make of this?" Buck asked, pointing at the marks with his Pulaski tool. I knelt down and touched the burned earth. Still warm, but not from normal fire heat. This was different. Wrong. "I don't know, Buck, but I got a bad feeling about it." That night, alone in my tower, I couldn't shake the image of those symbols. Martha always said I worried too much, but 22 years of watching over these mountains had taught me to trust my instincts. Something was stirring up there in the darkness, something that didn't want to be found. The wind picked up around midnight, howling through the guy wires of my tower. But underneath that familiar sound, I heard something else. Something that made me think maybe the old Cherokee stories weren't just stories after all. The screaming started 3 days later. I was checking the weather instruments just after dawn when it hit me. A sound like nothing I'd ever heard, even in the war. It started low, almost like singing, then rose to a shriek that made my teeth ache. Echoed off the mountains for what felt like forever before fading away. My first thought was mountain lion. Big cats can make sounds that'll freeze your blood. But this was different, louder, and it came from everywhere at once. I grabbed my binoculars and scanned the tree line, nothing moving except grass bending in the wind. But the wind was wrong too. It was blowing uphill, which never happened except before a big storm, and the air smelled like smoke, though I couldn't see any fires. The radio crackled. "Roan Tower, you copy?" "Go ahead, base." "We're getting reports of that screaming sound from all over the district. You hear anything up there?" "Yeah, I heard it. Sounded like it came from the North Ridge." Buck's heading up with a crew to investigate, guide them in. I spent the morning directing Buck's team toward the sound source, but every time they got close to where I thought it came from, the screaming would start up again from somewhere else, like it was moving, staying ahead of them. Around noon, Buck's voice came through the radio, tight with worry. "Hal, we found something." "What is it?" "You remember old Jonas Creek runs down the north face? It's... Christ, Hal, the whole creek bed is full of dead fish, and they ain't been dead long." I felt ice in my stomach. "What killed them?" "That's just it. They look burned. From the inside out." I told Buck to bring one of the fish up to the tower. When he arrived an hour later, sweating and pale, he handed me a trout that should have been swimming in cold mountain water. Instead, it was cooked through like someone had dropped it in boiling oil. "Water temperature was normal," Buck said, wiping his face with his sleeve. "But every fish for half a mile downstream looks just like this one." That afternoon, the screaming came again, closer this time and angrier. The sound made my radio equipment go crazy, speakers crackling and popping like a short circuit. But when the screaming stopped, everything worked fine again. Buck and his boys were setting up camp at the base of my tower when it happened. They'd decided to stay overnight, try to catch whatever was making the sound. Good men, all of them. I'd worked with most for years. We were sharing coffee and sandwiches around their camp stove when young Tommy Martinez pointed toward the eastern ridge. "Look at that." A wall of flame was rising from the ridgeline, but not spreading like normal fire. It was moving in a straight line like someone drawing with a burning stick across the mountainside. And it was moving fast. "That's impossible," Buck muttered, reaching for his radio. "Fire don't burn in straight lines." But it did. We watched it trace a perfect line from one end of the ridge to the other, then stop. Just stop, like someone had turned of an FA switch. "Base, this is Morrison. We need air support. Got a fire moving in an unnatural pattern on the east ridge." "Define unnatural, Buck." Buck looked at me, then at his men. "It's burning geometric shapes, Base. And it's moving against the wind." The silence on the radio lasted a long time. Finally, "Copy that, Morrison. Air support is 20 minutes out." But 20 minutes was too long. The line of fire began moving again, this time in a different direction. Then another line started from the south ridge, and another from the west. They were drawing something, connecting the burned symbols from 3 days ago. Tommy was the first to figure it out. "It's making a star," he said, pointing at the pattern of fire spreading across the mountainsides. "Look, you can see it from up here." He was right. The fires were burning in straight lines that would connect the original 6 fire sites in a perfect 6-pointed star, and we were sitting right in the middle of it. That's when the screaming came again, so loud it knocked Tommy off his feet, but this time I could hear words in it. Not English, not any language I knew, but words all the same. Old words that made my bones ache just hearing them. Buck was shouting into his radio, trying to coordinate with the air support when the temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds. Our breath started showing in the cold air, even though it had been warm all day. "Something's coming," I said, though I didn't know how I knew it. Buck looked up at me, his face pale in the firelight. "What's coming, Hal?" Before I could answer, the screaming started again. But now it wasn't coming from the ridge lines. It was coming from directly below us, rising up through the wooden floor of the fire tower like the mountain itself was crying out in pain. The star of fire was almost complete, and whatever was making that sound was getting ready to show itself. The helicopter arrived just as the last line of fire closed the star. I watched from my tower as it circled the burn pattern, the pilot's voice crackling over our roo. "Audio." Base, this is Air 7. I'm looking at the damnedest thing I ever saw. These fires are burning in perfect geometric lines, and they're all burning uphill against the wind. Buck keyed his radio. Can you drop suppression on them? Negative. They're too spread out and too organized. This isn't natural, boys. That's when Tommy started screaming. I looked down from the tower to see him standing at the edge of camp, pointing toward the center of the clearing. At first, I didn't see anything. Then the air began to shimmer like heat waves, even though the temperature was still dropping. Something was rising from the burned earth, tall and thin, made of smoke and flame, but shaped like a person. A woman, I thought, with long hair that moved like fire and arms stretched wide like she was calling to the sky. Jesus Christ, Buck whispered into his radio. Base, we need backup. We need... The thing in the clearing threw back its head and screamed. The sound hit us like a physical force, knocking me against the tower's railing. Buck's radio sparked and died. The helicopter overhead lurched sideways, the pilot fighting for control. Everyone back to the vehicles, Buck shouted, but his words were lost in the screaming. The firewoman began to move, gliding across the ground without touching it. Where she passed, the grass burst into flames. She was heading straight for Tommy, who stood frozen with terror. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe all those years watching over the mountain, feeling responsible for everyone who came up here. I grabbed the emergency flare gun from my tower supplies and fired it directly at the creature. The flare passed right through her like she was made of air, but it got her attention. She turned toward my tower, and I saw her face clearly for the first time. It wasn't human, burnt and twisted, with hollow spaces where eyes should be, and a mouth that opened too wide. But there was intelligence there, purpose, and rage that had been building for a very long time. She pointed one burning finger at me, and every piece of metal in a tools. My tower began to heat up, the railings, my equipment, even the buttons on my uniform. I had to let go of everything and press myself against the wooden walls. Down below, Buck was trying to get his men into their truck, but the engine wouldn't start. The electrical systems in everything, truck, radio, helicopter overhead, had failed the moment that thing appeared. The firewoman glided toward my tower, leaving a trail of burning grass behind her. As she got closer, I could feel the heat coming off her in waves. The wooden supports of the tower began to smoke. That's when I remembered something my grandmother used to tell me. She'd grown up around Cherokee families, learned some of their ways. When you're on sacred ground, she'd say, you show respect, take off your shoes, and humble yourself. It sounded crazy, but everything about this was crazy. I pulled off my boots and set them aside, then climbed down from the tower in my stocking feet. I'm sorry, I called out to the burning woman. We didn't know this was sacred ground. She stopped moving. The screaming faded to a low whistle, like wind through leaves. For a moment, the only sound was the helicopter struggling to stay in the air. Then she spoke. Not in English, but somehow I understood every word. You burn the holy places. You scar the Earth Mother's face. You will learn respect, or you will burn. We're just trying to stop the fires, I said, taking a step toward her. We're trying to protect the mountain. I am the fire. I am the mountain's voice. I am the price of broken promises. Behind her, more shapes were rising from the burned star pattern. Smaller figures dancing in flames that didn't consume them. The Cherokee spirits my grandmother had told me about, the ones that watched over the sacred balds. Your people promised to leave the high places alone, the firewoman continued. But the Tain, I lie. They build. They burn the sacred grass for houses and roads, so I burn them instead. I looked back at Buck and his men, still trapped by their dead truck. The helicopter was making emergency sounds, preparing to crash land in the clearing. What do you want us to do? I asked. Leave, all of you, and tell your people, the mountain remembers. Touch the sacred balds again, and I will wake every fire spirit from here to Georgia. Your towns will burn as you have burned us. The temperature dropped even further. My breath came out in white puffs as I stood there in my socks talking to a creature made of living flame. I'll tell them, I promised. "But you have to let my men go. They didn't know." She stared at me with those hollow eye sockets for what felt like forever. Then she raised one burning hand, and all the fires on the mountainsides went out at once. The helicopter's engine caught and stabilized. Buck's truck roared to life. "You spoke with respect," she said. "You removed your shoes on holy ground. This time, they may leave." But as she began to fade back into smoke and shadow, her voice carried a final warning. "I sleep light, Ranger, and I remember every slight." The official report called it coordinated arson by unknown suspects. The burned symbols were listed as vandalism with Native American motifs. The dead fish were blamed on a chemical spill that was never found. Nobody wanted to hear about fire spirits or Cherokee warnings, but I knew what I'd seen, and I knew it wasn't over. 3 weeks later, a development company announced plans to build a resort on the South Bald. Luxury mountain retreat, they called it. Golf course and condominiums with panoramic views. I drove down to their office in town the day after the announcement, told the project manager, a thin man in an expensive suit named Davidson, exactly what would happen if the I broke ground on sacred Cherokee land. He laughed at me. "Mr. Ridgway, with all due respect, you've been alone on that mountain too long. Maybe it's time to consider retirement." "I'm serious, Davidson. That land is protected, not by law, but by something older. The Cherokee were moved out 100 years ago. This is prime real estate now." I left his office knowing I'd failed, but I also knew the mountain wouldn't fail. Construction started on a Monday morning in April. The crew made it exactly 4 hours before the first accident. Their bulldozer operator, a man named Collins, was clearing grass for the foundation when his machine caught fire. Not the engine or the fuel tank. The whole machine just burst into flames while he was driving it. Collins jumped clear with second-degree burns on his hands and arms. "Electrical short," the fire marshal ruled, even though bulldozers don't have enough electrical systems to cause that kind of fire. They brought in a replacement dozer on Wednesday. This one made it 6 hours before the same thing happened. Different operator, same result. Man jumped clear just before his machine became a fireball. By Friday, word was getting around. Construction workers are superstitious folks, and they started calling the project the curse job. Half the crew quit before the weekend. Davidson hired new workers from out of state, men who hadn't heard the stories. They lasted 3 days. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when the work crew found their equipment arranged in a perfect circle around the construction site. Every piece of machinery, dozers, backhoes, dump trucks, even the portable toilets, moved during the night and positioned like points on a compass. Nobody had heard anything. The night watchman swore he'd been awake all night, never saw or heard anyone moving that equipment. Davidson was furious. He accused the local workers of sabotage, brought in security guards, set up floodlights around the whole site. That night I was in my tower when the screaming started again, louder than before, and Greer. The sound rolled down the mountain like thunder, echoing off every ridge and valley. The security guards quit before dawn. When Davidson arrived at the job site the next morning, he found all his equipment exactly where it had been the day before. But every piece of metal was twisted and melted like it had been through a forge. The insurance company refused to pay. They said the damage was inconsistent with any known natural phenomenon or act of vandalism. Davidson tried to sue everyone he could think of, the county, the state, even me personally, but the lawyers all told him the same thing. He couldn't prove anyone had done anything to his equipment. The project died within a month. Davidson's company went bankrupt trying to replace machines that kept mysteriously catching fire or melting overnight. But the mountain wasn't finished with him. Davidson wouldn't let it go. 6 months after his company folded, he came back with private investors and a new plan. Heritage Resort, he called it, celebrating the natural beauty and Native American history of the region. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the real story. He'd learned from his mistakes, though. This time, he started small. A single cabin built just outside the Sacred Bald, far enough from the worst incidents but close enough to claim the mountain views his investors wanted. For 3 weeks, construction went smoothly. The workers were careful, respectful. They even brought in a Cherokee elder from the reservation to bless the ground before they started. But the elder, an old man named Joseph Crow Feather, took one look at the site and shook his head. "This is not right," he told Davidson. "The mountain spirits are still angry. Building here will only make it worse." Davidson ignored him. The cabin was nearly finished when I got the call. "Hal, you need to get down here," Buck said over the radio. He was working part-time for the county fire department now, responding to calls in the mountain districts. "We got a structure fire at that new cabin site, but this one's different." I drove down from my tower to find the cabin fully engulfed in flames that burned straight up into the sky without any wind. The fire department was there, but their hoses couldn't get close enough to spray water on it. "Water turns to steam before it reaches the building," Buck told me. "Temperature gauge shows normal air temperature, but that fire's burning like a blast furnace." Davidson was there too, standing well back from the flames, his face pale with shock and fear. "It just started burning," he kept saying. "No electrical problems, no gas leaks, it just started." That's when I saw her again. The firewoman standing in the flames like they were cool water. She wasn't screaming this time. She was watching Davidson with those hollow eyes, and I could feel her satisfaction even from 50 yards away. The cabin burned for 6 hours. When the flames finally died down, there was nothing left but a perfect circle of ash. Not a single ember had spread to the surrounding grass. Davidson left town the next day and never came back. I retired from the Forest Service 2 years later, but I kept a cabin near the base of Roan Mountain. Martha passed away in '67, and the kids think I should move somewhere with better medical care, closer to civilization. But I can't leave. Someone needs to watch over the mountain, to remember the warnings and pass them on to anyone fool enough not to listen. Every few years, someone new shows up with plans to develop the sacred balds. Real estate developers, government agencies, even well-meaning conservation groups who want to build visitor centers and hiking trails. I tell them all the same story. Most don't believe me, some do. The ones who don't believe usually change their minds after the first equipment fire or the night they hear screaming echoing off the ridgelines. The Cherokee called this place the Mountain of Screaming Winds, for good reason. The wind still screams here when it's angry, and the mountain has a long memory for those who don't show proper respect. I'm 83 now, and I won't be around much longer to keep watch. But I've been teaching the story to my grandson, young Hal Jr., and he's been teaching it to his kids, because the firewoman wasn't lying when she said the mountain remembers. I've seen her twice more over the years, always when someone threatens the sacred places. She's still there, still watching, still ready to defend the high country that the Cherokee knew was holy long before the first white man ever set foot in these mountains. So if you're ever up on Roan Mountain, walking those beautiful grass balds that stretch out like green carpets under the sky, remember to show respect. Take off your shoes if you can. Say a quiet thank you to the spirits who keep this place safe. And if you hear screaming in the wind, don't ignore it. That's the mountain's voice, warning you that some places are too sacred to disturb. The fire spirits are still there, sleeping light and remembering everything. And fire, once awakened, burns until there's nothing left to burn. My name is Bill Grayson, and I've been a park ranger on the Blue Ridge Parkway for 16 years. In all that time, I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. Lost hikers, bear encounters, drunk campers. You name it, I've dealt with it. But I never believed in ghost stories. Not until November of 1976. I was 43 then, divorced for 5 years, and living alone in a small ranger cabin near Waynesboro. My job was visitor services and historical interpretation, which meant I knew every Civil War battlefield, every old cemetery, and every local legend from here to Asheville. The tourists loved the ghost stories, especially around Halloween. I'd roll my eyes and tell them the real history instead. Ghost stories are just tourism marketing, I used to say. People want to be scared, so we give them what they want. Cataract Falls sits in a deep hollow about 3 miles from the main parkway. It's a beautiful spot, a 100-foot waterfall tumbling down moss-covered rocks, surrounded by thick rhododendron bushes that bloom pink in spring. Most visitors never make it there because the trail is steep and rough. No cell phone coverage, no easy parking. Just you, the forest, and the sound of water. The trouble started in early November when the summer crowds were gone and the leaves had mostly fallen. 3 different visitors came to the ranger station in 1 week, all telling the same strange story. They'd hiked to Cataract Falls and heard a woman crying somewhere near the water. When they tried to find her, they couldn't see anyone, just the sound of sobbing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Probably just the wind through the rocks, I told them. Sound carries funny in that hollow. But then Mrs. Patterson from Richmond came in on a Thursday morning, shaking like a leaf. She was maybe 60, the kind of proper Southern lay, who wouldn't make up stories for attention. "There's a woman down there who needs help," she said, gripping my desk with white knuckles. I could hear her clear as day, crying like her heart was broken. But when I called out, she stopped. Then I heard her again from a different spot. "I searched for 20 minutes, Mr. Grayson. There was nobody there." Something in her voice made me listen. Mrs. Patterson wasn't the type to spook easily. She'd been hiking these mountains for 30 years. "Did you see anything unusual?" I asked. "Any signs someone had been camping there?" "That's just it," she said. "The whole place felt wrong. Cold, even though it was a warm day. And the waterfall. I know this sounds crazy, but it seemed like it was crying too." I assured her I'd check it out, mostly to put her mind at ease. But as I gathered my gear that afternoon, first aid kit, radio, flashlight, camera, I found myself thinking about the old stories. The locals had always whispered about Cataract Falls. Something about a Civil War widow who lost her children. But I'd never paid much attention to folklore. The hike to the falls took me about an hour through bare November woods. Dry leaves crunched under my boots, and the air smelled of wood smoke from distant cabins. Everything seemed normal until I got within a quarter mile of the waterfall. That's when I noticed the silence. The birds had stopped singing. Even the squirrels were quiet. Just my footsteps and the growing sound of falling water ahead. I'd been to these falls 100 times, but something felt different. The air seemed thicker, harder to breathe. Like a storm was coming, even though the sky was clear. When I reached the falls, I stood there for a long time, listening. The water crashed down into a pool maybe 20 feet across, then flowed away through the rhododendrons. Mist rose from where it hit the rocks, catching the late afternoon sun, beautiful and peaceful. But Mrs. Patterson was right about the cold. Even in my jacket, I felt a chill that seemed to come from inside my bones. I set up camp about 50 yards from the falls, close enough to hear anything unusual, but far enough back to stay dry. The plan was simple: spend the night, see if I could figure out what was spoking the visitors, then write a report for the park supervisor. Probably just echoes from the water, or maybe an injured animal hiding in the rocks. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast. I built a small fire and made coffee, enjoying the peace and quiet. This was why I loved the job. Moments like this when the mountains felt like home. Around 8 o'clock, I decided to take another look at the falls with my flashlight. That's when I heard it. A woman's voice, soft and sad, somewhere near the water. Not words exactly, just the sound of someone crying. The same thing the visitors had described. I stood perfectly still, listening hard, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The crying stopped. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" Silence. Just the waterfall and my own heartbeat. I swept my flashlight beam across the rocks, looking for any sign of a person. Nothing but wet stone and dripping moss. But as I turned to go back to my fire, I heard it again. Closer this time, and definitely coming from near the pool at the bottom of the falls. "Ma'am, I'm a park ranger," I shouted. "If you're hurt, I can help you." The crying turned into something that might have been words, too faint to understand. I scrambled down the slippery rocks toward the pool, my light dancing ahead of me. The sound seemed to move, leading me around the edge of the water. Then I saw the dress. It was hanging from a low branch maybe 10 feet from the water's edge. An old-fashioned dress, the kind women wore to church 100 years ago. Long sleeves, high collar, made of some heavy, dark fabric. But here's what made my skin crawl. It was soaking wet, dripping steadily onto the dead leaves below, and there hadn't been any rain for 3 days. I approached it slowly, my flashlight beam shaking. The dress looked real enough, but how had it gotten there? And why was it wet? I reached out to touch it, and that's when the temperature around me dropped 20 degrees in about 2 seconds. My breath came out in white puffs, and frost began forming on the nearby rocks. The crying started again, much louder now, coming from right behind me. I spun around, sweeping my light in all directions. Nothing. But in the mist rising from the waterfall, just for a second, I thought I saw the shape of a woman. Tall and thin, wearing what looked like the same kind of dress hanging from the tree. When I blinked, she was gone. My radio crackled with static, even though I was supposed to be out of range. Through the noise, I could swear I heard a voice saying something about children. My flashlight flickered and dimmed, even though I'd put in fresh batteries that morning. I backed away from the dress, suddenly feeling like I was being watched. The crying had stopped again, but the cold remained. Everything in my training told me to stay calm, investigate, find a logical explanation. But everything in my gut told me to get out of there. I spent the rest of the night by my fire, jumping at every sound. The dress was still there in the morning, still dripping wet. I took pictures and bagged it as evidence, trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation. Back at the station, I called my friend Sarah Dennison, who worked as a historian for the Park Service. If anyone knew the real stories behind the local legends, it would be Sarah. "Bill, you sound terrible," she said when I described what had happened. "Are you sure you're feeling okay?" "I'm fine," I lied. "I just need to know about Cataract Falls. The old stories, I mean. What really happened there?" "Sess." Ara was quiet for a moment. "You mean about Martha Whitmore?" "Who's Martha Whitmore?" "The widow. She lost her husband at Antietam in 1862, then came back to the mountains with her 2 young children. They were hiding from Union soldiers in some caves near the falls when there was a collapse. The children were killed, but Martha survived. Local stories say she went mad from grief and threw herself off the waterfall. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. When did this happen? November 1862, exactly 114 years ago this month. Sarah agreed to meet me at the falls the next morning. She was curious about the dress and wanted to examine it in the place where I'd found it. We hiked in together, carrying research materials and better camera equipment. "You know, I've always been fascinated by the Martha Whitmore story," Sarah said as we walked. "There are actually records of her in the National Archives. She was real, not just folklore. But the details about her death are unclear." The dress was still there, still wet. In daylight, it looked even stranger. The fabric was thick wool, hand-sewn with tiny stitches. The style was definitely from the 1860s, but it looked almost new. No fading, no moth holes, no signs of age. "This is impossible," Sarah said, examining it closely. "Even if someone left this here as a prank, wool doesn't stay this wet for 3 days without a water source. And look at these buttons. They're made of wood and bone, exactly like the ones from Civil War-era clothing." We photographed everything and took samples of the fabric. Sarah was excited by the historical implications, but I kept thinking about the crying woman I'd seen in the mist. I hadn't told her about that part yet. As we worked, the temperature began dropping again, even though it was a sunny morning. Our breath started showing in the air, and frost formed on the rocks near the waterfall. "Bill, this is weird," Sarah said, checking her thermometer. "It's 20 degrees colder here than it was 50 yards back up the trail." That is when we heard the voice. Clear as day, a woman speaking somewhere near the pool. Not crying this time, but talking, like she was having a conversation with someone we couldn't see. "My babies," the voice said. "Where are my babies?" Sarah grabbed my arm, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" Before I could answer, we both saw her. A woman in a white dress standing waist-deep in the pool at the bottom of the falls. She was looking around frantically, as if searching for something. Her hair was long and dark, hanging wet around her shoulders. Her dress was the same style as the one we'd found. but this one was white instead of dark wool. "Ma'am," Sarah called out, starting toward the water. "Are you all right?" The woman turned toward us, and that's when I saw her face. Or where her face should have been. Instead, there was just a dark hollow, like looking into deep water at night. But somehow I could tell she was looking right at us. "Help me find them," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the roar of the waterfall. "They're lost in the dark. They're afraid." Sarah had stopped moving, staring in shock. The woman began walking toward us, but her feet didn't disturb the water. She moved like she was floating just above the surface. "Sarah, we need to go," I said quietly. But Sarah was transfixed. "Martha? Is that Martha Whitmore?" The woman stopped. When she spoke again, her voice was filled with such pain that it made my chest hurt to hear it. "You know my name. Will you help me? Will you help me find my children?" "Where are they?" Sarah asked, taking another step toward the water. "In the cave. The rocks fell and I can't reach them. They've been crying for so long." Sarah looked back at me, and I could see she was thinking about actually helping this thing. The rational part of my brain was screaming warnings, but another part was feeling sorry for the woman. The grief in her voice was real, even if she wasn't. "Sarah, don't," I said. "Something's not right here." But Sarah was already wading into the pool. "If there are children trapped, somewhere we have to help." The water only came up to her knees, but as soon as she got close to the woman in white, everything changed. The spirit's form became clearer, more solid. I could see her face now, beautiful but twisted with sorrow and rage. Her eyes were completely black, like looking into empty sockets. "You'll help me," she said to Sarah. It wasn't a question anymore. Sarah nodded, as if she was in a trance. "Yes, I'll help you find them." That's when I realized Sarah was in real danger. I'd seen missing persons cases where people became obsessed with helping someone who didn't exist, walking deeper and deeper into the wilderness until they were lost forever. I splashed into the water after her. "Sarah, snap out of it. We're leaving now." But as soon as I touched Sarah's arm, the woman in white let out a scream that made the rocks around us vibrate. The sound was pure anguish, but underneath it was something else. Anger. Rage at being denied what she wanted. The waterfall suddenly stopped flowing. For just a moment, the 100-foot cascade hung motionless in the air like a frozen curtain. Then it crashed down all at once, sending a wall of water toward us. I grabbed Sarah and pulled her toward shore as hard as I could. The spirit was following us, walking on top of the churning water, her mouth open in that terrible scream. The temperature dropped so fast that ice began forming on the surface of the pool. We made it to the rocks at the edge just as the water behind us turned to solid ice. Sarah was conscious but confused, like she was waking up from a deep sleep. "What happened?" she asked. "Where's the woman who needed help?" I looked back at the pool. It was normal again. No ice, no woman in white, just clear water and mist. But I could still feel her watching us from somewhere we couldn't see. "We need to leave," I said. "Right now." We didn't speak much on the hike back, but I could tell Sarah was remembering bits and pieces. By the time we reached my truck, she was pale and shaking. "Bill, that woman, she wasn't alive, was she?" I shook my head. "I don't think so." That evening, Sarah came to my cabin with a stack of historical documents she'd pulled from the archives. We spread them out on my kitchen table. Military records, land deeds, newspaper clippings from the 1860s. "I found more about Martha Whitmore," she said, "and it's worse than I thought. She didn't just lose her children in a cave-in. She caused it." According to the records, Martha had been hiding with her 2 young children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, in limestone caves near the falls. Union soldiers were searching the area for Confederate sympathizers. But Martha wasn't just hiding, she was protecting something. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a faded letter. Martha's husband was part of a Confederate unit that robbed a Union payroll train. They hid the gold somewhere near the falls before he left for Virginia. Martha knew where it was. The letter was from Martha's sister, describing the tragic events. When Union soldiers found the cave, Martha refused to come out or tell them where the gold was hidden. She was so determined to protect her dead husband's secret that she started collapsing the cave entrance herself, thinking the soldiers would give up and leave. Instead, she trapped herself and her children inside. The soldiers eventually dug them out, but the children had suffocated. Martha survived, but her mind was broken by guilt and grief. She didn't throw herself off the waterfall, Sarah said quietly. She died in an asylum 3 years later. But according to local stories, her spirit came back to the falls, still looking for her children. I thought about the woman in the pool, the desperate way she'd searched for her babies. She'd been trapped by her own guilt for over a century, unable to move on because she couldn't forgive herself for what she'd done. Sarah, we have to go back there. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Are you crazy? That thing almost killed us today. No, she almost killed you because you tried to help her. But what if we could actually help? What if we could find those children's remains and give them a proper burial? Sarah stared at the documents for a long time. You really think that would work? I don't know. But I think she's getting stronger, more desperate. What happens when the next visitor tries to help her? What happens when she decides to make someone stay permanently? We spent the rest of the night planning. If Martha's children had died in a cave collapse near the falls, there might be remains we could locate and properly bury. It was a long shot, but it felt like the right thing to do. The next morning, we returned to Cataract Falls with metal detectors, shovels, and climbing gear. We also brought a local minister, Reverend Thompson, who was willing to perform a burial service if we found anything. The spirit was waiting for us. As soon as we got within sight of the waterfall, the temperature dropped and mist began forming impossible shapes in the air. But this time, Martha didn't appear in the pool. She materialized on the rocks above us, looking down with those hollow black eyes. You came back, she said, and her voice echoed off the stone walls of the hollow. We want to help you find your children, I called up to her, but you have to tell us where to look. For a moment, she seemed to flicker, becoming more solid and more transparent at the same time. When she spoke, her voice was different, less angry, more hopeful. The cave, behind the falling water. But I can't go back there. I looked at the waterfall and realized what she meant. There was a space behind the cascade, hidden by the rushing water. We'd need ropes to get there safely, but it was possible. It took us 2 hours to set up the climbing equipment and work our way behind the waterfall. The space was bigger than I'd expected, a natural cave about the size of a small room. And there, in a corner where the rock had collapsed long ago, we found them. 2 small skeletons, still wearing scraps of 1860s children's clothing. They were huddled together like they'd been trying to comfort each other in their final moments. Sarah was crying as we carefully gathered the remains. Even Reverend Thompson had tears in his eyes. These children had been lost for over a century, their mother's spirit unable to rest because she'd never been able to say goodbye. When we emerged from behind the waterfall with the children's remains, Martha was standing on the shore of the pool. But she looked different now. Younger, more like the woman she'd been before grief destroyed her. Her face was clear, beautiful and sad, but no longer terrifying. My babies, she whispered, reaching toward the small bones we carried. We buried the children in a sunny spot overlooking the falls, with Reverend Thompson saying words over their graves. As he spoke about peace and forgiveness, Martha knelt beside the small mounds of earth, finally able to touch them after all these years. I'm sorry, she said to them. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you. But then something wonderful happened. 2 small figures appeared beside her, translucent and glowing, but clearly the shapes of children. The boy and girl reached out and took their mother's hands. It's okay, Mama, the little girl said. We understand. We forgive you. Martha looked up at us one last time, and now her face showed peace instead of anguish. Thank you, she said. Thank you for bringing them home. The 3 figures faded away together, walking hand in hand into a light that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the waterfall. The temperature returned to normal, and for that first time since this all started, the hollow felt peaceful. We reported Sarah's death as an accidental drowning. The official story was that she'd slipped on wet rocks while photographing the waterfall. I was the only witness, and I stuck to the approved version. Nobody would have believed the truth anyway. But Sarah didn't actually die that day at the falls. That happened 3 weeks later, back at her apartment in Charlottesville. The coroner said it was a heart attack, but I knew better. Helping Martha had taken something out of her, some essential spark that kept her tethered to life. She'd given part of herself to ease a spirit's century of suffering. The Park Service temporarily closed the trail to Cataract Falls after Sarah's accident. When it reopened 6 months later, visitors reported that the area felt different somehow, peaceful. The crying woman was never heard again. But my encounter with Martha Whitmore changed everything for me. I couldn't go back to dismissing every ghost story as folklore or tourism marketing. I started researching other Civil War sites throughout the region, interviewing locals about strange experiences, documenting stories that had been passed down through generations. What I found was disturbing. The Civil War had left scars on these mountains that went deeper than history books recorded. There were other spirits like Martha, people who died with such intense guilt or grief that death couldn't free them from their pain. And some of them were getting stronger. I retired from the Park Service 2 years early and started working with paranormal researchers and historians. We've documented dozens of cases throughout Appalachia, spirits trapped by their own emotions, unable to move on without help from the living. Most of them aren't dangerous, just lost and hurting. But a few are filled with the kind of anger that can reach across centuries, the kind that sees the living as either tools to be used or obstacles to be removed. Martha found peace because she genuinely loved her children and only wanted to be reunited with them. But what about the Confederate deserter who hanged himself rather than face court-martial? What about the Union soldier who burned a civilian house with a family still inside? What about all the people who died here carrying secrets too terrible to confess? They're still out there, in lonely hollows and forgotten battlefields, growing stronger as the years pass. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is right, you can hear them calling out to the living. If you ever find yourself hiking alone in these mountains and you hear someone crying for help, think twice before you answer. Some spirits can be saved with compassion and understanding. Others will drag you down into their darkness if you give them the chance. The dead don't always rest easy in Appalachia. And some grief is so strong it can transcend death itself, reaching across the years to touch anyone foolish enough to listen. Trust me on this. I learned it the hard way at Cataract Falls in 1976 when I met Martha Whitmore and discovered that some ghost stories are more than just stories. They're warnings. My name is Doug Ashford, and I've been a park ranger for 19 years. I've pulled 47 people off these mountains, alive and dead. I know every trail, every cliff, every weather pattern that can kill you up here. But what happened on Mount Mitchell in December of 1967 changed everything I thought I knew about these mountains. People always ask me if I believe in ghosts. Before that winter, I'd laugh and say the only spirits on Mount Mitchell were the ones tourists brought in hip flasks. The Cherokee used to call this place the Mountain of the Dark Spirit, but I figured that was just old stories. I was wrong. Mount Mitchell stands 6,684 feet tall, the highest peak east of the Mississippi. Up on the summit, we run a weather station that feeds critical storm data to the National Weather Service. It's my job to keep that station running, no matter what Mother Nature throws at us. 3-hour hike in good weather, impossible in bad. That December, we were tracking a monster storm rolling in from the west. The call came in at 2:47 p.m. on December 15th. I remember because I was updating my logbook when the radio crackled to life. Doug, this is dispatch. We've lost contact with the weather station. Pete's not answering his hourly check-in. Pete Kowalski ran the summit station. Good man, careful as they come. 43 years old, 2 kids at home. He'd worked storms before without missing a single radio call. "How long since his last check-in?" I asked. 4 hours. "Storm's supposed to hit hard tonight. We need those readings." I looked out my cabin window. The sky was already turning that sick yellow-gray color that means serious snow. The wind was picking up, making the spruce trees dance. Temperature had dropped 15 degrees in the past hour. "I'll head up there," I said. If Pete's equipment failed, he might need help with repairs. I'd made this climb hundreds of times. I packed my emergency kit: rope, crampons, first aid supplies, extra batteries for the radio, emergency flares, and enough food for 2 days. The Weather Service was calling for 3 feet of snow and winds up to 70 miles per hour. If I got caught up there, I might be stuck for days. The hike started normal enough. I knew every switchback, every rock formation. But about halfway up, I noticed something that made me stop. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, not even the sound of wind through the trees. Just my boots crunching through the snow and my own breathing. Then I saw the tracks, fresh footprints in the snow, heading toward the summit. But they were wrong somehow. Too big, too deep. And there was something else. Something that took me a few minutes to figure out. The tracks had no shadows. I stopped and looked at my own footprints. Clear shadows from the weak winter sun. But these other tracks? Nothing. Like whatever made them didn't exist in the normal world. I shook my head. Must be tired. Maybe the strange light was playing tricks on me. I kept climbing, but that feeling of wrongness grew stronger with every step. The temperature gauge on my pack showed minus 20 degrees. That was impossible. It had been 15 above when I left the cabin an hour ago. Mountains get cold fast, but not that fast. When I reached the weather station at 6:30 p.m., the sun was almost down. The building looked normal from the outside, a small concrete structure with radio antennas and weather instruments. But Pete's truck wasn't there. I called out as I approached the door. "Pete, you in there?" No answer. I tried the radio from outside. "Pete, this is Doug. Come in." Static. The door was unlocked, which wasn't like Pete. Inside, all the equipment was running normally. Temperature readings, wind speed, barometric pressure, all being recorded automatis, Cali. But Pete was nowhere to be found. Then I noticed my radio wasn't working. Battery was full, but no signal. I tried my flashlight. Dead. Pulled out fresh batteries, put them in. Dead. Within seconds. That's when I found Pete. He was outside, behind the building, sitting against the wall like he'd just decided to take a rest. Frozen solid. But here's the thing that made my blood run cold. Pete wasn't dressed for the weather. No coat, no hat, no gloves, just his regular work clothes. And his face. His face looked peaceful, like he'd just gone to sleep. I checked for a pulse, knowing I wouldn't find one. His skin was hard as stone, white as the snow around him. But there were no signs of hypothermia, no shivering position, no curled-up posture. He was just sitting there, calm as could be. The weird part was the snow around him. It formed perfect circles, like something had been walking around Pete's body. But there were no footprints, just those smooth circles in the snow, maybe 8 feet across. I radioed for help, but my radio was still dead. Tried to start Pete's truck to drive down for backup, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Battery was completely drained, even though Pete had used it to drive up that morning. Night was falling fast. The storm was moving in. I could see lightning in the clouds, which was strange for a snowstorm. The wind was picking up, making sounds through the trees that almost sounded like voices. I decided to stay in the weather station overnight and hike down first thing in the morning with Pete's body, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Around 9 p.m., I was checking the weather instruments when I saw movement outside. A figure walking through the trees, maybe 100 yards away. Tall, moving strange, too smooth, like it was floating instead of walking. "Hey!" I called out. "You need help?" The figure stopped, turned toward me. But even with my flashlight, which was working again somehow, I couldn't make out any details. Just a dark shape against the white snow. It started moving toward the mess station. I locked the door and watched through the window. The figure came closer, and that's when I realized what was wrong with the way it moved. It wasn't leaving footprints. This thing was walking on top of the snow without breaking through. When it got about 30 feet from the building, it stopped. Just stood there. I couldn't see a face, couldn't see any features at all. It was like looking at a person-shaped hole cut out of the night. "What do you want?" I called through the window. It raised one arm and pointed at the building. At me. The temperature inside the station started dropping. I could see my breath. The thermometer on the wall went from 60 degrees to 40 to 20 in the space of a minute. Ice started forming on the windows. The figure moved closer. 20 feet. 10 feet. It came right up to the window and looked in. I still couldn't see a face, but I could feel it looking at me. The cold was so intense now that I was shivering uncontrollably. My teeth were chattering so hard I thought they might break. Then it spoke. Not with a voice exactly, but somehow I heard words in my head. "You don't belong here." The window frosted over completely. When I wiped it clear a few seconds later, the figure was gone. But the cold remained. And somewhere in the distance I heard Pete's truck engine start up. I spent the night huddled next to the emergency heater, but it barely kept the frost off my clothes. Every few hours I'd hear Pete's truck engine running outside, but when I looked out the windows, I couldn't see it anywhere. Morning came gray and dim. The storm had hit during the night, 3 feet of fresh snow, just like predicted. But when I stepped outside, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were tracks everywhere, dozens of them, all the same size as the ones I'd seen on the way up, all without shadows. They circled the weather saint. Appalachian, like whatever made them, had been walking around the building all night. Some tracks went right up to the walls, others led off into the forest in different directions. But they all had one thing in common. They were too deep for the soft snow, like whatever made them weighed a lot more than it looked. I checked on Pete. He was still there, still frozen. But something was different. He was sitting in a different position. I was sure of it. Yesterday, his head had been tilted to the right. Now it was tilted to the left, and his eyes were open. I tried the radio again. Still dead. Pete's truck was where he'd parked it, but the engine was cold. Whatever I'd heard starting up during the night, it wasn't this truck. I had to get down the mountain, had to get help. But as I started to pack up, I heard voices. "Doug, where are you?" It was Mary Wisenant, another ranger. She worked the South District, but we'd partnered on rescues before. Good head on her shoulders, steady in a crisis. "Up here," I called back. "At the weather station." I heard the helicopter before I saw it. Park Service rescue bird, coming in low through the storm clouds. It set down in a clearing about 50 yards from the station. Mary jumped out, along with Dr. Sarah Blackhorse, our emergency medic. "What's the situation?" Mary asked as they approached. "Pete's dead, frozen, but something's not right about it." Dr. Blackhorse examined Pete while Mary and I talked. The doc had Cherokee heritage and knew the old stories about Mount Mitchell. When she stood up from Pete's body, her face was grim. "This isn't hypothermia," she said. "I've seen hypothermia victims. They curl up, try to preserve body heat. Pete looks like something drained the warmth right out of him." "Drained?" Mary asked. "His core temperature is lower than it should be, even after being frozen all night. It's like every bit of heat was pulled from his body, instantly." I told them about the figure I'd seen, the voices, the tracks without shadows. Mary listened without interrupting, but I could see the doubt in her eye, as Dr. Blackhorse nodded like she'd heard this before. "My grandfather told stories about something like this," she said. "Something that walks in winter, feeds on warmth. He called it the Shadow Walker." "Cherokee legends," Mary said. "Come on, Sarah." "Look at the tracks," I said. We followed the strange footprints into the forest. They led to places no human could go, straight up cliff faces, across gaps too wide to jump. At one point, the tracks went directly through a boulder the size of a small house. "Okay," Mary said. "That's weird." The tracks led us deeper into the forest, to a place I'd never seen before, even after 19 years on this mountain. A small clearing surrounded by dead trees. The ground was covered with strange ice formations, spirals and curves that looked almost like writing, and there were bones, lots of them, human bones, scattered around the clearing like an old battlefield. Dr. Blackhorse knelt down and examined a skull. "This has been here for years," she said. "Decades, maybe. Look at this." She held up a leg bone. The marrow is gone, completely hollowed out. "How many people?" I asked. She looked around the clearing, counting. "At least 20, maybe more." 20 people don't just disappear without someone noticing, Mary said. "They do if they disappear one at a time," Dr. Blackhorse replied. "Over the years, hikers who got lost, climbers who never came back, always in winter." The radio in the helicopter crackled to life. We all heard it clearly. "Help! Trapped! Can't get warm!" It was Pete's voice. Mary ran for the helicopter. "Pete, this is Mary. Where are you?" "So cold. It's taking the warmth. Can't fight it." "Pete, give us your location." But the radio went dead. Dr. Blackhorse grabbed my arm. "We need to leave. Now." "We can't leave, Pete." "Pete is dead, Doug. That wasn't Pete on the radio." But Mary was all room, Edie trying to start the helicopter. The engine turned over once, twice, then nothing. She tried again. Nothing. "Battery's dead," she called out. "Just like the truck." That's when we saw it coming through the trees, 8 feet tall, walking smooth as silk through the snow. The Shadow Walker. And it wasn't alone. 3 of them emerged from different directions, moving through the forest like they owned it. They surrounded our clearing, cutting off any escape route. Up close, I could see they weren't completely solid, more like shadows given form, dark shapes that bent light around them. "Nobody move," Dr. Blackhorse whispered. "Don't run. It triggers their hunting instinct." The largest one, the one I'd seen outside the weather station, stepped into the clearing. The temperature dropped so fast that frost formed on our clothes instantly. My breath came out in thick clouds. "You came back," it said. And again I heard the words in my head rather than with my ears. "Good." "What do you want?" I managed to ask through chattering teeth. "What we have always wanted. What was promised to us." Dr. Blackhorse stepped forward. "You're the curse, aren't you? The shadow my grandfather spoke of." The creature's head turned toward her. "Your blood remembers, yes. We were guardians once, protectors of the sacred places. But we were betrayed, cursed to eternal cold, eternal hunger." "By who?" "By those who came before you. The Cherokee elders, long dead. They feared our power, so they bound us to this mountain, made us prisoners in our own land." "So you kill innocent people?" "We take what we need to survive. Warmth. Life. It is not killing. It is feeding." Mary had been slowly reaching for the emergency flare gun in the helicopter. One of the smaller creatures noticed and glided toward her with impossible speed. "Mary, don't," I started to say. She fired. The flare hit the creature's center mass and passed right through it like it was made of smoke. But the creature screamed, a sound like winter wind through dead trees, and suddenly became more solid. "Fire," Dr. Blackhorse. She breathed. "Fire makes them real." The creature that had been shot stumbled backward, now casting a shadow of its own. Mary fired another flare, then another. The emergency flares lit up the clearing like daylight. The Shadow Walkers hated it. They moved away from the light, becoming less solid, more like ordinary shadows again. But they didn't retreat completely. "The fuel," I said, remembering the weather station. "The emergency generator has 50 gallons of diesel fuel." We ran. Behind us I could hear the creatures following, but the flare light seemed to slow them down. We made it to the weather station as the last flare burned out. I grabbed the fuel can from the generator room while Mary and Dr. Blackhorse barricaded the door. The Shadow Walkers were already outside, circling the building. The temperature was dropping fast. "They're draining the heat from the entire building," Dr. Blackhorse said. Ice was forming on the walls inside. I splashed diesel fuel around the interior of the station and grabbed matches from the emergency kit. "Everyone get ready to run." "Where?" Mary asked. "They've got us surrounded." "The helicopter. If we can make enough fire, enough light, maybe we can get the engine started." The door started to buckle. Something was pulling it from the outside, tearing the metal like paper. Through the cracks I could see darkness flowing in like water. I lit the match. The weather station exploded into flames. The shadow walkers shrieked, a sound that seemed to come from the wind itself. Through the windows I could see them retreating from the light, becoming thin and weak. We ran for the helicopter through walls of fire and light. Behind us, the weather station burned like a signal beacon against the night. Mary got the engine started. Somehow the heat from the fire had recharged the batteries. As we lifted off, I looked back at the mountain. Atim. The shadow walkers were gathering at the edge of the firelight, waiting, watching. Even from the air I could feel their cold eyes following us. But we were alive. We'd made it. Or so I thought. The official report blamed Pete's death on equipment failure and hypothermia. The weather station fire was listed as an electrical accident caused by the storm. Nobody wanted to hear about shadow creatures or Cherokee curses, but I know what I saw, and I know what's still up there. The cold never left me after that night. Even in summer, even in 90-degree heat, I can't get warm. Dr. Blackhorse says it's trauma, that my mind is playing tricks on me. But sometimes, on winter nights, I can feel them out there, waiting. Mary transferred to a different park system 3 months later, said she needed a change of scenery. Dr. Blackhorse went back to her reservation in Oklahoma. We don't talk about what happened on Mount Mitchell, but every winter, people still go missing on that mountain. Hikers who wandered off marked trails, climbers who never came back to base camp, always in winter, always when the shadows are longest. The Park Service rebuilt the weather station, installed better equipment, hired new staff. But they can't keep people working up there during winter months. Equipment fails, batteries drain, and the cold gets so bad that even with industrial heaters, the staff can barely function. I retired early. Couldn't handle the mountains anymore, knowing what was up there, but I still monitor the emergency frequencies during winter storms. Still listen for voices that shouldn't be there, calling for help that can't be given. Last week, a young couple from Tennessee went hiking on Mount Mitchell. They had good equipment, plenty of experience. The weather was clear when they started up the trail. They found the man 2 days later sitting peacefully against a tree, frozen solid, just like Pete. No signs of hypothermia, no indication of struggle. His girlfriend is still missing. If you're planning to visit Mount Mitchell, do yourself a favor. Go in summer. Go with friends. And if you hear voices calling your name from the shadows, don't answer, because some things are better left alone in the dark. The shadow walker is still up there, waiting for the next warm soul to wander into its domain. And winter on Mount Mitchell lasts a very long time.